Book 3, Chapter 9 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 3, Chapter 9. Storm in the South, the Witch's Cavern. It was when the heats of noon died gradually away from the earth that Glaucus and Ione went forth to enjoy the cool and grateful air. At that time, various carriages were in use among the Romans. The one most used by the richer citizens, when they required no companion in their excursion, was the biga, already described in the early portion of this work. That appropriated to the matrons was termed the carpentum, which had commonly 2 wheels. The ancients used also a sort of litter, a vast sedan chair, more commodiously arranged than the modern, inasmuch as the occupant thereof could lie down at ease, instead of being perpendicularly and stiffly jostled up and down. There was another carriage, used both for traveling and for excursions in the country. It was commodious, containing 3 or 4 persons with ease, having a covering which could be raised at pleasure, and, in short, answering very much the purpose of, though very different in shape from, the modern briska. It was a vehicle of this description that the lovers, accompanied by 1 female slave of Ione, now used in their excursion. About 10 miles from the city there was at that day an old ruin, the remains of a temple, evidently Grecian, and as for Glaucus and Ione, everything Grecian possessed an interest. They had agreed to visit these ruins. It was thither they were now bound. Their road lay among vines and olive groves, till, winding more and more towards the higher ground of Vesuvius, the path grew rugged. The mules moved slowly, and with labor, and at every opening in the wood they beheld those gray and horrent caverns indenting the parched rock, which Strabo has described, but which the various revolutions of time and the volcano have removed from the present aspect of the mountain. The sun, sloping towards his descent, cast long and deep shadows over the mountain. Here and there they still heard the rustic reed of the shepherd amongst copses of the beechwood and wild oak. Sometimes they marked the form of the silk-haired and graceful Capella, with its wreathing horn and bright grey eye, which, still beneath the Ausonian skies, recalls the eclogues of Maro, browsing halfway up the hills. And the grapes, already purple with the smiles of the deepening summer, glowed out from the arched festoons which hung pendant from tree to tree. Above them, light clouds floated in the serene heavens, sweeping so slowly athwart the firmament that they scarcely seemed to stir, while, on their right, they caught, ever and anon, glimpses of the waveless sea, with some light bark skimming its surface, and the sunlight breaking over the deep in those countless and softest hues so peculiar to that delicious sea. "How beautiful," said Glaucus in a half-whispered tone, "is that expression by which we call earth our mother! With what a kindly, equal love she pours her blessings upon her children! And even to those sterile spots to which nature has denied beauty, she yet contrives to dispense her smiles. Witness the arbutus and the vine, which she wreathes over the arid and burning soil of yon extinct volcano. Ah, in such an hour and scene as this, well might we imagine that the fawn should peep forth from those green festoons, or that we might trace the steps of the mountain nymph through the thickest mazes of the glade. But the nymphs ceased, beautiful Ione, when thou wert created." There is no tongue that flatters like a lover's, and yet, in the exaggeration of his feelings, flattery seems to him commonplace, strange and prodigical exuberance, which soon exhausts itself by overflowing. They arrived at the ruins. They examined them with that fondness with which we trace the hallowed and household vestiges of our own ancestry. They lingered there till Hesperus appeared in the rosy heavens, and then, returning homeward in the twilight, they were more silent than they had been, for in the shadow and beneath the stars they felt more oppressively their mutual love. It was at this time that the storm which the Egyptian had predicted began to creep visibly over them. At first, a low and distant thunder gave warning of the approaching conflict of the elements, and then rapidly rushed above the dark ranks of the serried clouds. The suddenness of storms in that climate is something almost preternatural, and might well suggest to early superstition the notion of a divine agency. A few large drops broke heavily among the boughs that half overhung their path, And then, swift and intolerably bright, the forked lightning darted across their very eyes, and was swallowed up by the increasing darkness. "Swifter, good Carocarius," said Glaucus to the driver. "The tempest comes on apace." The slave urged on the mules. They went swift over the uneven and stony road. The clouds thickened, near and more near broke the thunder, and fast rushed the dashing rain. "Dost thou fear?" whispered Glaucus, as he sought excuse in the storm to come nearer to Ione. "Not with thee," she said softly. At that instant the carriage, fragile and ill contrived, as, despite their graceful shapes, were, for practical uses, most of such inventions at that time, struck violently into a deep rut, over which lay a log of fallen wood. The driver, with a curse, stimulated his mules yet faster for the obstacle. The wheel was torn from the socket, and the carriage suddenly overset. Glaucus, quickly extricating himself from the vehicle, hastened to assist Ione, who was fortunately unhurt. With some difficulty they raised the caruca, or carriage, and found that it ceased any longer even to afford them shelter. The springs that fastened the covering were snapped asunder, and the rain poured fast and fiercely into the interior. In this dilemma, what was to be done? They were yet some distance from the city. No house, no aid, seemed near. "There is," said the slave, "a smith about a mile off. I could seek him, and he might fasten at least the wheel of the caruca. By Jupiter! How the rain beats! My mistress will be wet before I come back." "Run thither at least," said Glaucus. "We must find the best shelter we can till you return." The lane was overshadowed with trees, beneath the amplest of which Glaucus drew Ione. He endeavored, by stripping his own cloak, to shield her yet more from the rapid rain, but it descended with a fury that broke through all puny obstacles. And suddenly, while Glaucus was yet whispering courage to his beautiful charge, the lightning struck one of the trees immediately before them, and split with a mighty crash its huge trunk in twain. This awful incident apprised them of the danger they braved in their present shelter, and Glaucus looked anxiously round for some less perilous place of refuge. "We are now," he said, "halfway up the ascent of Vesuvius. There ought to be some cavern, or hollow in the vine-clad rocks, could we but find it, in which the deserting nymphs have left a shelter." While thus saying, he moved from the trees, and looking wistfully toward the mountain, discovered through the advancing gloom a red and tremulous light at no considerable distance. "That must come," he said, "from the hearth of some shepherd or vine-dresser. It will guide us to some hospitable retreat. Wilt thou stay here while I— Yet no, that would be to leave thee to danger." "I will go with you cheerfully," said Ione. "Open as the space seems, it is better than the treacherous shelter of these boughs." Half leading, half carrying Ione, Glaucus, accompanied by the trembling female slave, advanced toward the light, which yet burned red and steadfastly. At length the space was no longer open. Wild vines entangled their steps, and hid from them, save by imperfect intervals, the guiding beam. But faster and fiercer came the rain, and the lightning assumed its most deadly and blasting form. They were still, therefore, impelled onward, hoping at last, if the light eluded them, to arrive at some cottage or some friendly cavern. The vines grew more and more intricate. The light was entirely snatched from them, but a narrow path, which they trod with labor and pain, guided only by the constant and long-lingering flashes of the storm, continued to lead them towards its direction. The rain ceased suddenly. Precipitous and rough crags of scorched lava frowned before them, rendered more fearful by the lightning that illumined the dark and dangerous soil. Sometimes the blaze lingered over the iron-gray heaps of scoria, covered in part with ancient mosses or stunted trees, as if seeking in vain for some gentler product of earth, more worthy of its ire, and sometimes leaving the whole of that part of the scene in darkness. The lightning, broad and sheeted, hung redly over the ocean, tossing far below, until its waves seemed glowing into fire. And so intense was the blaze, that it brought vividly into view even the sharp outline of the more distant windings of the bay, from the eternal Misenum, with its lofty brow, to the beautiful Sorrentum and the giant hills behind. Our lovers stopped in perplexity and doubt, when suddenly, as the darkness that gloomed between the fierce flashes of lightning once more wrapped them round, they saw near, but high before them, the mysterious light. Another blaze, in which heaven and earth were reddened, made visible to them the whole expanse. No house was near, but just where they had beheld the light, they thought they saw in the recess of the cavern the outline of a human form. The darkness once more returned. The light, no longer pale beneath the fires of heaven, burned forth again. They resolved to ascend towards it. They had to wind their way among vast fragments of stone, here and there overhung with wild bushes, but they gained nearer and nearer to the light, and at length they stood opposite the mouth of a kind of cavern, apparently formed by huge splinters of rock that had fallen transversely athwart each other. And, looking into the gloom, each drew back involuntarily with a superstitious fear and chill. A fire burned in the far recess of the cave, and over it was a small cauldron. On a tall and thin column of iron stood a rude lamp. Over that part of the wall, at the base of which burned the fire, hung in many rows, as if to dry, a profusion of herbs and weeds. A fox, crouched before the fire, gazed upon the strangers with its bright and red eye, its hair bristling, and a low growl stealing from between its teeth. In the center of the cave was an earthen statue, which had 3 heads of a singular and fantastic cast. They were formed by the real skulls of a dog, a horse, and a boar. A low tripod stood before this wild representation of the popular Hecate. But it was not these appendages and appliances of the cave that thrilled the blood of those who gazed fearfully therein. It was the face of its inmate. Before the fire, with the light shining full upon her features, sat a woman of considerable age. Perhaps in no country are there seen so many hags as in Italy. In no country does beauty so awfully change, in age, to hideousness the most appalling and revolting. But the woman now before them was not one of these specimens of the extreme of human ugliness. On the contrary, her countenance betrayed the remains of a regular but high and aquiline order of feature. With stony eyes turned upon them, with a look that met and fascinated theirs, they beheld in that fearful countenance the very image of a corpse. The same, the glazed and lustreless regard, the blue and shrunken lips, the drawn and hollow jaw, the dead, lank hair of a pale gray, the vivid green ghastly skin which seemed all surely tinged and tainted by the grave. "It is a dead thing," said Glaucus. "Nay, it stirs. It is a ghost or larva," faltered Ione as she clung to the Athenian's breast. "Oh, away, away!" groaned the slave. "It is the witch of Vesuvius." "Who are ye?" said a hollow and ghostly voice, "and what do ye here?" The sound, terrible and deathlike as it was, suiting well the countenance of the speaker, and seeming rather the voice of some bodiless wanderer of the Styx than living mortal, would have made Ione shrink back into the pitiless fury of the storm. But Glaucus, though not without some misgiving, drew her into the cavern. "We are storm-beaten wanderers from the neighboring city," he said, "and decoyed hither by yon light. We crave shelter and the comfort of your hearth." As he spoke, the fox rose from the ground and advanced towards the strangers, showing, from end to end, its white teeth, and deepening in its menacing growl. "Down, slave!" said the witch, and at the sound of her voice the beast dropped at once, covering its face with its brush, and keeping only its quick, vigilant eye fixed upon the invaders of its repose. "Come to the fire, if ye will," said she, turning to Glaucus and his companions. "I never welcome living things, save the owl, the fox, the toad, and the viper. So I cannot welcome ye, but come to the fire without welcome. Why stand upon form?" The language in which the hag addressed them was a strange and barbarous Latin, interlarded with many words of some more rude and ancient dialect. She did not stir from her seat, but gazed stonily upon them as Glaucus now released Ione of her outer wrapping garments, and making her place herself on a log of wood, which was the only other seat he perceived at hand, fanned with his breath the embers into a more glowing fire. The slave, encouraged by the boldness of her superiors, divested herself also of her long pela, and crept timorously to the opposite corner of the hearth. "We disturb you, I fear," said the silver voice of Ione, in conciliation. The witch did not reply. She seemed like one who has awakened for a moment from the dead, and has then relapsed once more into the eternal slumber. "Tell me," she said suddenly, and after a long pause, "are ye brother and sister?" "No," said Ione, blushing. "Are ye married?" Not so, replied Glaucus. Ho, lovers! Ha, 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 ha! And the witch laughed so loud and so long that the caverns rang again. The heart of Ione stood still at that strange mirth. Glaucus muttered a rapid counterspell to the omen, and the slave turned as pale as the cheek of the witch herself. Why dost thou laugh, old crone? Said Glaucus, somewhat sternly, as he concluded his invocation. Did I laugh? Said the hag absently. She is in her dotage, whispered Glaucus. As he said this, he caught the eye of the hag fixed upon him with a malignant and vivid glare. Thou liest, she said abruptly. Thou art an uncourteous welcomer, returned Glaucus. Hush, provoke her not, dear Glaucus, whispered Ione. I will tell thee why I laughed when I discovered ye were lovers, said the old woman. It was because it is a pleasure to the old and withered to look upon young hearts like yours, and to know the time will come when you will loathe each other. Loathe, loathe, ha 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 ha! It was now Ione's turn to pray against the unpleasing prophecy. The gods forbid, she said. Yet, poor woman, thou knowest little of love, or thou wouldst know that it never changes. Was I young once, think ye, returned the hag quickly, and am I old and hideous and deathly now? Such as is the form, so is the heart. With these words she sank again into a stillness profound and fearful, as if the cessation of life itself. Hast thou dwelt here long? Said Glaucus after a pause, feeling uncomfortably oppressed beneath the silence so appalling. Ah, long. Yes. It is but a drear abode. Ha, thou mayest well say that. Hell is beneath us, replied the hag, pointing her bony finger to the earth, and I will tell thee a secret. The dim things below are preparing wrath for ye above, you, the young, and the thoughtless, and the beautiful. Thou utterest but evil words, ill becoming the hospitable, said Glaucus, and in future I will brave the tempest rather than thy welcome. Thou wilt do well. None shall ever seek me, save the wretched. And why the wretched? Asked the Athenian. I am the witch of the mountain, replied the sorceress, with a ghastly grin. My trade is to give hope to the hopeless. For the crossed in love I have philters. For the avaricious, promises of treasure. For the malicious, potions of revenge. For the happy and the good, I have only what life has, curses. Trouble me no more. With this, the grim tenant of the cave relapsed into a silence so obstinate and sullen that Glaucus in vain endeavored to draw her into further conversation. She did not evince, but any alteration of her locked and rigid features, that she even heard him. Fortunately, however, the storm, which was brief as violent, began now to relax. The rain grew less and less fierce, and at last, as the clouds parted, the moon burst forth in the purple opening of heaven, and streamed clear and full into that desolate abode. Never had she shone, perhaps, on a group more worthy of the painter's art. The young, the all-beautiful Ione, seated by that rude fire, her lover already forgetful of the presence of the hag, at her feet, gazing upward to her face, and whispering sweet words, the pale and affrighted slave at a little distance, and the ghastly hag resting her deadly eyes upon them, yet seemingly serene and fearless, for the companionship of love hath such power, were these beautiful beings, things of another sphere, in that dark and unholy cavern, with its gloomy quaintness of appurtenance. The fox regarded them from his corner with his keen and fiery eye, and as Glaucus now turned towards the witch, he perceived for the first time, just under her seat, the bright gaze and crested head of a large snake. Whether it was that vivid coloring of the Athenian's cloak, thrown over the shoulders of Ione, attracted the reptile's anger. Its crest began to glow and rise, as if menacing and preparing itself to spring upon the Neapolitan. Glaucus caught quickly at one of the half-burned logs upon the hearth, and, as if enraged at the action, the snake came forth from its shelter, and with a loud hiss raised itself on end till its height nearly approached that of the Greek. "Witch!" cried Glaucus, "command thy creature, or thou wilt see it dead." "It has been despoiled of its venom," said the witch, aroused at his threat, but ere the words had left her lip, the snake had sprung upon Glaucus. Quick and watchful, the agile Greek leaped lightly aside, and struck so fell and dexterous a blow on the head of the snake that it fell prostrate and writhing among the embers of the fire. The hag sprung up and stood confronting Glaucus with a face which would have befitted the fiercest of the Furies. So utterly dire and wrathful was its expression, yet even in horror and ghastliness preserving the outline and trace of beauty, and utterly free from that coarse grotesque at which the imaginations of the North have sought the source of terror. "Thou hast," she said, in a slow and steady voice, which belied the expression of her face, so much was it passionless and calm, "thou hast had shelter under my roof, and warmth at my hearth. Thou hast returned evil for good. Thou hast smitten and haply slain the thing that loved me and was mine. Nay, more, the creature, above all others, consecrated to gods and deemed venerable by man. Now hear thy punishment. By the moon, who is the guardian of the sorceress, by Orcus, who is the treasurer of wrath, I curse thee, and thou art cursed. May thy love be blast. May thy name be blackened. May the infernals mark thee. May thy heart wither and scorch. May thy last hour recall to thee the prophet voice of the saga of Vesuvius. And thou," she added, turning sharply towards Ione and raising her right arm, when Glaucus burst impetuously on her speech. "Hag," he cried, "forbear! Me thou hast cursed, and I commit myself to the gods. I defy and scorn thee. But breathe but one word against yon maiden, and I will convert the oath on thy foul lips to thy dying groan. Beware!" "I have done," replied the hag, laughing wildly, "for in thy doom is she who loves the accursed, and not the less, that I heard her lips breathe thy name, and know by what word to commend thee to the demons. Glaucus, thou art doomed." So saying, the witch turned from the Athenian, and kneeling down beside her wounded favorite, which she dragged from the hearth, she turned to them her face no more. "O Glaucus," said Ione, greatly terrified, "what have we done? Let us hasten from this place. The storm has ceased. Good mistress, forgive him. Recall thy words. He meant but to defend himself. Accept this peace offering to unsay the said." And Ione, stooping, placed her purse on the hag's lap. "Away," she said bitterly, "away! The oath once woven the fates only can untie. Away!" "Come, dearest," said Glaucus impatiently. "Thinkest thou that the gods above us or below hear the impotent ravings of dotage? Come!" Long and loud rang the echoes of the cavern with the dread laugh of the saga. She deigned no further reply. The lovers breathed more freely when they gained the open air. Yet the scene they had witnessed, the words and the laughter of the witch, still fearfully dwelt with Ione, and even Glaucus could not thoroughly shake off the impression they had bequeathed. The storm had subsided, save, now and then, a low thunder muttered in the distance amidst the darker clouds, or a momentary flash of lightning affronted the sovereignty of the moon. With some difficulty they regained the road, where they found the vehicle already sufficiently repaired for their departure, and the Carucarius calling loudly upon Hercules to tell him where his charge had vanished. Glaucus vainly endeavored to cheer the exhausted spirits of Ione, and scarce less vainly to recover the elastic tone of his own natural gaiety. They soon arrived before the gate of the city. As it opened to them, a litter borne by slaves impeded their way. "It is too late for egress," cried the sentinel to the inmate of the litter. "Not so," said a voice which the lovers started to hear. It was a voice they well recognized. "I am bound to the villa of Marcus Polybius. I shall return shortly. I am Arbaces the Egyptian." The scruples of him at the gate were removed, and the litter passed close beside the carriage that bore the lovers. "Arbaces at this hour? Scarce recovered too, methinks? Whither or for what can he leave the city?" said Glaucus. "Alas," replied Ione, bursting into tears, "my soul feels still more and more the omen of evil. Preserve us, O ye gods, or at least," she murmured inly, "preserve my Glaucus." End of Book 3, Chapter 9. Book 3, Chapter 10 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Bulwer. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 3, Chapter 10. The Lord of the Burning Belt and his Minion. Fate writes her prophecy in red letters, but who shall read them? Arbaces had tarried only till the cessation of the tempest allowed him, under cover of night, to seek the saga of Vesuvius. Borne by those of his trustier slaves, in whom in all more secret expeditions he was accustomed to confide, he lay extended along his litter, and resigning his sanguine heart to the contemplation of vengeance gratified and love possessed. The slaves in so short a journey moved very little slower than the ordinary pace of mules, and Arbaces soon arrived at the commencement of a narrow path, which the lovers had not been fortunate enough to discover, but which, skirting the thick vines, led at once to the habitation of the witch. Here he rested the litter, and bidding his slaves conceal themselves and the vehicle among the vines from the observation of any chance passenger, he mounted alone, with steps still feeble but supported by a long staff, the drear and sharp ascent. Not a drop of rain fell from the tranquil heaven, but the moisture dripped mournfully from the laden boughs of the vine, and now and then collected in tiny pools in the crevices and hollows of the rocky way. Strange passions these for a philosopher, thought Arbaces, that lead one like me just new from the bed of death, and lapped even in health amidst the roses of luxury, across such nocturnal paths as this. But passion and vengeance treading to their goal can make an Elysium of a Tartarus. High, clear, and melancholy shone the moon above the road of that dark wayfarer, glossing herself in every pool that lay before him, and sleeping in shadow along the sloping mount. He saw before him the same light that had guided the steps of his intended victims, but, no longer contrasted by the blackened clouds, it shone less redly clear. He paused, as at length he approached the mouth of the cavern, to recover breath, and then, with his wonted collected and stately mien, he crossed the unhallowed threshold. The fox sprang up at the ingress of this newcomer, and by a long howl announced another visitor to his mistress. The witch had resumed her seat, and her aspect of grave-like and grim repose. By her feet, upon a bed of dry weeds which half covered it, lay the wounded snake, but the quick eye of the Egyptian caught its scales glittering in the reflected light of the opposite fire, as it writhed, now contracting, now lengthening its folds, in pain and unsated anger. "Down, slave!" said the witch, as before, to the fox, and, as before, the animal dropped to the ground, mute but vigilant. "Rise, servant of Nox and Erebus," said Arbaces commandingly. "A superior in thine art salutes thee. Rise and welcome him." At these words the hag turned her gaze upon the Egyptian's towering form and dark features. She looked long and fixedly upon him, as he stood before her in his oriental robe, and folded arms, and steadfast and haughty brow. "Who art thou," she said at last, "that callest thyself greater in art than the saga of the burning fields, and the daughter of the perished Etrurian race?" "I am he," answered Arbaces, "from whom all cultivators of magic, from north to south, from east to west, from the Ganges and the Nile to the vales of Thessaly and the shores of the yellow Tiber, have stooped to learn." "There is but one such man in these places," answered the witch, "whom the men of the outer world, unknowing his loftier attributes and more secret fame, call Arbaces the Egyptian. To us of a higher nature and deeper knowledge, his rightful appellation is Hermes of the burning girdle." "Look again," returned Arbaces, "I am he." As he spoke he drew aside his robe, and revealed a censer seemingly of fire, that burned round his waist, clasped in the center by a plate whereupon was engraven some sign apparently vague and unintelligible, but which was evidently not unknown to the saga. She rose hastily and threw herself at the feet of Arbaces. "I have seen, then," said she, in a voice of deep humility, "the Lord of the mighty girdle. Vouchsafe my homage." "Rise," said the Egyptian, "I have need of thee." So saying, he placed himself on the same log of wood on which Ione had rested before, and motioned to the witch to resume her seat. "Thou sayest," said he, as she obeyed, "that thou art a daughter of the ancient Etrurian tribes. The mighty walls of those rock-built cities yet frown above the robber race that hath seized upon their ancient reign. Partly came those tribes from Greece, partly were they exiles from a more burning and primeval soil. In either case, thou art of Egyptian lineage, for the Grecian masters of the aboriginal Helot were among the restless sons whom the Nile banished from her bosom. Equally then, O Saga, thy descent is from ancestors that swore allegiance to mine own. By birth and by knowledge art thou the subject of Arbaces. Hear me then, and obey." The witch bowed her head. "Whatever art we possess in sorcery," continued Arbaces, "we are sometimes driven to natural means to attain our object. The ring and the crystal, and the ashes and the herbs, do not give unerring divinations, neither do the higher mysteries of the moon yield even the possessor of the girdle a dispensation from the necessity of employing ever and anon human measures for a human object. Mark me, then. Thou art deeply skilled, methinks, in the secrets of the more deadly herbs. Thou knowest those which arrest life, which burn and scorch the soul from out her citadel, or freeze the channels of young blood into that ice which no sun can melt. Do I overrate thy skill? Speak, and truly." "Mighty Hermes, such lore is, indeed, mine own. Deign to look at these ghostly and corpse-like features. They have waned from the hues of life merely by watching over the rank herbs which simmer night and day in yon cauldron." The Egyptian moved his seat from so unblessed and so unhealthful a vicinity as the witch spoke. "It is well," he said. "Thou hast learned that maxim of all the deeper knowledge which saith, despise the body to make wise the mind. But to thy task. There cometh to thee by tomorrow's starlight a vain maiden, seeking of thine art a love charm to fascinate from another the eyes that should utter but soft tales to her own. Instead of thy philters, give the maiden one of thy most powerful poisons. Let the lover breathe his vows to the shades." The witch trembled from head to foot. "Oh, pardon, pardon, dread master," said she falteringly. "But this I dare not. The law in these cities is sharp and vigilant. They will seize, they will slay me." "For what purpose, then, thy herbs and thy potions, vain Saga?" said Arbaces, sneeringly. The witch hid her loathsome face with her hands. "Oh, years ago," she said in a voice unlike her usual tones, so plaintive was it, and so soft, "I was not the thing that I am now. I loved, I fancied myself beloved." "And what connection hath thy love, witch, with my commands?" said Arbaces impetuously. "Patience," resumed the witch. "Patience, I implore you. I loved another and less fair than I, yes, by Nemesis, less fair. Allured from me my chosen. I was of that dark Etrurian tribe to whom most of all were known the secrets of the gloomier magic. My mother was herself a Saga. She shared the resentment of her child. From her hands I received the potion that was to restore me his love, and from her also the poison that was to destroy my rival. Oh, crush me, dread walls! My trembling hands mistook the phials. My lover fell indeed at my feet, but dead, dead, dead. Since then, what has been life to me? I became suddenly old. I devoted myself to the sorceries of my race. Still, by an irresistible impulse, I curse myself with an awful penance. Still, I seek the most noxious herbs. Still, I concoct the poisons. Still, I imagine that I am to give them to my hated rival. Still, I pour them into the phial. Still, I fancy that they shall blast her beauty to the dust. Still, I wake and see the quivering body, the foaming lips, the gazing eyes of my Aulus, murdered, and by me." The skeleton frame of the witch shook beneath strong convulsions. Arbaces gazed upon her with a curious though contemptuous eye. "And this foul thing has yet human emotions," thought he. "Still she cowers over the ashes of the same fire that consumes Arbaces. Such are we all. Mystic is the tie of those mortal passions that unite the greatest and the least." He did not reply till she had somewhat recovered herself, and now sat rocking to and fro in her seat, with glassy eyes fixed on the opposite flame, and large tears rolling down her livid cheeks. "A grievous tale is thine, in truth," said Arbaces, "but these emotions are fit only for our youth. Age should harden our hearts to all things but ourselves. As every year adds a scale to the shellfish, so should each year wall and encrust the heart. Think of these frenzies no more. And now, listen to me again. By the revenge that was dear to thee, I command thee to obey me. It is for vengeance that I seek thee. This youth whom I would sweep from my path has crossed me, despite my spells. This thing of purple embroidery, of smiles and glances, soulless and mindless, with no charm but that of beauty. Accursed be it, this insect, this Glaucus. I tell thee, by Orcus and by Nemesis, he must die. And working himself up at every word, the Egyptian, forgetful of his debility, of his strange companion, of everything but his own vindictive rage, strode, with large and rapid steps, the gloomy cavern. Glaucus, sayest thou, mighty master? Said the witch abruptly, and her dim eye glared at the name with all that fierce resentment at the memory of small affronts so common amongst the solitary and the shunned. Aye, so he is called, but what matters the name? Let it not be heard as that of a living man 3 days from this date. Hear me, said the witch, breaking from a short reverie into which she was plunged after this last sentence of the Egyptian. Hear me, I am thy thing and thy slave, spare me. If I give to the maiden thou speakest of that which would destroy the life of Glaucus, I shall be surely detected. The dead ever find avengers. Nay, dread man, if thy visit to me be tracked, if thy hatred to Glaucus be known, thou mayest have need of thy archest magic to protect thyself. Ha! Said Arbaces, stopping suddenly short, and as a proof of that blindness with which passion darkens the eyes even of the most acute. This was the first time when the risk that he himself ran by this method of vengeance had occurred to a mind ordinarily wary and circumspect. But, continued the witch, if instead of that which arrests the heart, I give that which shall sear and blast the brain, which shall make him who quaffs it unfit for the uses and career of life, an abject, raving, benighted thing, smiting sense to drivelling youth, to dotage, will not thy vengeance be equally sated, thy object equally attained? O witch, no longer the servant but the sister, the equal of Arbaces, how much brighter is woman's wit, even in vengeance, than ours? How much more exquisite than death is such a doom? And, continued the hag, gloating over her fell scheme, in this is but little danger, for by 10,000 methods, which men forbear to seek, can our victim become mad. He may have been among the vines and seen a nymph, or the vine itself may have had the same effect. Ha ha! They never inquire too scrupulously into these matters in which the gods may be agents. And let the worst arrive. Let it be known that it is a love charm. Why, madness is a common effect of philters, and even the fair, she that gave it, finds indulgence in the excuse. Mighty Hermes, have I ministered to thee cunningly? Thou shalt have 20 years longer date for this, returned Arbaces. I will write anew the epic of thy fate on the face of the pale stars. Thou shalt not serve in vain the master of the flaming belt. And here, Saga, carve thee out, by these golden tools, a warmer cell in this dreary cavern. One service to me shall countervail 1,000 divinations by sieve and shears to the gaping rustics. So saying, he cast upon the floor a heavy purse, which clinked not unmusically to the ear of the hag, who loved the consciousness of possessing the means to purchase comforts she disdained. Farewell, said Arbaces, fail not. Outwatch the stars in concocting thy beverage. Thou shalt lord it over thy sisters at the walnut tree. When thou tellest them thy patron and thy friend is Hermes the Egyptian, tomorrow night we meet again. He stayed not to hear the valediction or the thanks of the witch. With a quick step he passed into the moonlit air and hastened down the mountain. The witch, who followed his steps to the threshold, stood at the entrance of the cavern, gazing fixedly on his receding form, and as the sad moonlight streamed over her shadowy form and death-like face, emerging from the dismal rocks, it seemed as if one gifted, indeed, by supernatural magic had escaped from the dreary Orcus, and the foremost of its ghostly throng stood at its black portals. vainly summoning his return, or vainly sighing to rejoin him. The hag, then slowly re-entering the cave, groaningly picked up the heavy purse, took the lamp from its stand, and, passing to the remotest depth of her cell, a black and abrupt passage, which was not visible, save at a near approach, closed round as it was with jutting and sharp crags, yawned before her. She went several yards along this gloomy path, which sloped gradually downwards, as if towards the bowels of the earth, and, lifting a stone, deposited her treasure in a hole beneath, which, as the lamp pierced its secrets, seemed already to contain coins of various value, wrung from the credulity or gratitude of her visitors. "I love to look at you," she said, apostrophizing the moneys, "for when I see you I feel that I am indeed of power, and I am to have 20 years longer life to increase your store. O thou great Hermes!" She replaced the stone and continued her path onward for some paces, when she stopped before a deep irregular fissure in the earth. Here, as she bent, strange, rumbling, hoarse, and distant sounds might be heard, while ever and anon, with a loud and grating noise which, to use a homely but faithful simile, seemed to resemble the grinding of steel upon wheels, volumes of streaming and dark smoke issued forth, and rushed spiraling along the cavern. "The shades are noisier than their wont," said the hag, shaking her grey locks, and looking into the cavity, she beheld, far down, glimpses of a long streak of light, intensely but darkly red. "Strange!" she said, shrinking back. "It is only within the last 2 days that dull, deep light hath been visible. What can it portend?" The fox, who had attended the steps of his fell mistress, uttered a dismal howl, and ran cowering back to the inner cave. A cold shuddering seized the hag herself at the cry of the animal, which, causeless as it seemed, the superstitions of the time considered deeply ominous. She muttered her placatory charm, and tottered back into her cavern, where, amidst her herbs and incantations, she prepared to execute the orders of the Egyptian. "He called me dotard," said she, as the smoke curled from the hissing cauldron. "When the jaws drop, and the grinders fall, and the heart scarce beats, it is a pitiable thing to dote. But when," she added, with a savage and exulting grin, "the young and the beautiful and the strong are suddenly smitten into idiocy, ah, that is terrible. Burn, flame, simmer, herb, swelter, toad, I curse him, and he shall be cursed." On that night, and at the same hour which witnessed the dark and unholy interview between Arbaces and the Saga, Apacides was baptized. End of Book 3, Chapter 10. Book 3, Chapter 11, of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 3, Chapter 11. Progress of Events. The plot thickens. The web is woven, but the net changes hands. "And you have the courage then, Julia, to seek the witch of Vesuvius this evening, in company too with that fearful man?" "Why, Nydia," replied Julia timidly, "dost thou really think there is anything to dread? These old hags, with their enchanted mirrors, their trembling sieves, and their moon-gathered herbs are, I imagine, but crafty impostors, who have learned, perhaps, nothing but the very charm for which I apply to their skill, and which is drawn from the knowledge of the field's herbs and simples. Wherefore should I dread? Dost thou not fear thy companion? What? Arbaces? By Diane, I never saw a lover more courteous than that same magician, and were he not so dark, he would be even handsome." Blind as she was, Nydia had the penetration to perceive that Julia's mind was not one that the gallantries of Arbaces were likely to terrify. She therefore dissuaded her no more, but nursed in her excited heart the wild and increasing desire to know if sorcery had indeed a spell to fascinate love to love. "Let me go with thee, noble Julia," she said at length. "My presence is no protection, but I should like to be beside thee to the last. Thine offer pleases me much, replied the daughter of Diomed. Yet how canst thou contrive it? We may not return until late. They will miss thee. Ione is indulgent, replied Nydia. If thou wilt permit me to sleep beneath thy roof, I will say that thou, an early patroness and friend, hast invited me to pass the day with thee, and sing thee my Thessalian songs. Her courtesy will readily grant to thee so light a boon. Nay, ask for thyself, said the haughty Julia. I stoop to request no favor from the Neapolitan. Well, be it so. I will take my leave now, make my request, which I know will be readily granted, and return shortly. Do so, and thy bed shall be prepared in my own chamber. With that, Nydia left the fair Pompeian. On her way back to Ione, she was met by the chariot of Glaucus, on whose fiery and curveting steeds was riveted the gaze of the crowded street. He kindly stopped for a moment to speak to the flower girl. Blooming as thine own roses, my gentle Nydia, and how is thy fair mistress? Recovered, I trust, from the effects of the storm? I have not seen her this morning, answered Nydia. But what? Draw back, the horses are too near thee. But think you Ione will permit me to pass the day with Julia, the daughter of Diomed? She wishes it, and was kind to me when I had few friends. The gods bless thy grateful heart. I will answer for Ione's permission. Then may I stay over the night, and return tomorrow, said Nydia, shrinking from the praise she so little merited. As thou and fair Julia please. Commend me to her, and hark ye, Nydia, when thou hearest her speak, note the contrast of her voice with that of the silver-toned Ione. Vale! His spirits entirely recovered from the effect of the past night, his locks waving in the wind, his joyous and elastic heart bounding with every spring of his Parthian steeds, a very prototype of his country's god, full of youth and of love, Glaucus was borne rapidly to his mistress. Enjoy while ye may the present. Who can read the future? As the evening darkened, Julia, reclined within her litter, which was capacious enough also to admit her blind companion, took her way to the rural baths indicated by Arbaces. To her natural levity of disposition, her enterprise brought less of terror than of pleasurable excitement. Above all, she glowed at the thought of her coming triumph over the hated Neapolitan. A small but gay group was collected round the door of the villa. As her litter passed by it to the private entrance of the baths appropriated to the women. Methinks by this dim light, said one of the bystanders, I recognize the slaves of Diomed. True, Clodius, said Sallust. It is probably the litter of his daughter Julia. She is rich, my friend. Why dost thou not proffer thy suit to her? Why, I had once hoped that Glaucus would have married her. She does not disguise her attachment. And then, as he gambles freely and with ill success, the sesterces would have passed to thee, wise Clodius. A wife is a good thing, when it belongs to another man. But, continued Clodius, as Glaucus is, I understand, to wed the Neapolitan, I think I must even try my chance with the dejected maid. After all, the lamp of Hymen will be gilt, and the vessel will reconcile one to the odor of the flame. I shall only protest, my Sallust, against Diomed's making thee trustee to his daughter's fortune. Ha, ha! Let us within, my compositor. The wine and the garlands await us. Dismissing her slaves to that part of the house set apart for their entertainment, Julia entered the baths with Nydia, and declining the offers of the attendants, passed by a private door into the garden behind. She comes by appointment, be sure, said one of the slaves. What is that to thee? Said a superintendent sourly. She pays for the baths, and does not waste the saffron. Such appointments are the best part of the trade. Hark! Do you not hear the widow Fulvia clapping her hands? Run, fool, run! Julia and Nydia, avoiding the more public part of the garden, arrived at the place specified by the Egyptian. In a small circular plot of grass the stars gleamed upon the statue of Silenus. The merry god reclined upon a fragment of rock, the lynx of Bacchus at his feet, and over his mouth he held, with extended arm, a bunch of grapes, which he seemingly laughed to welcome ere he devoured. I see not the magician, said Julia, looking round, when, as she spoke, the Egyptian slowly emerged from the neighboring foliage, and the light fell palely over his sweeping robes. Salve, sweet maiden, but ha! Whom hast thou here? We must have no companions. "It is but the blind flower girl, wise magician," replied Julia, herself a Thessalian. "Oh, Nydia!" said the Egyptian. "I know her well." Nydia drew back and shuddered. "Thou hast been at my house, methinks," said he, approaching his voice to Nydia's ear. "Thou knowest the oath. Silence and secrecy, now as then, or beware. Yet," he added musingly to himself, "why confide more than is necessary, even in the blind? Julia, canst thou trust thyself alone with me? Believe me, the magician is less formidable than he seems." As he spoke, he gently drew Julia aside. "The witch loves not many visitors at once," said he. "Leave Nydia here till your return. She can be of no assistance to us, and, for protection, your own beauty suffices. Your own beauty and your own rank. Yes, Julia, I know thy name and birth. Come, trust thyself with me, fair rival of the youngest of the Naiads." The vain Julia was not, as we have seen, easily affrighted. She was moved by the flattery of Arbaces, and she readily consented to suffer Nydia to await her return. Nor did Nydia press her presence. At the sound of the Egyptian's voice, all her terror of him returned. She felt a sentiment of pleasure at learning she was not to travel in his companionship. She returned to the bathhouse, and in one of the private chambers waited their return. Many and bitter were the thoughts of this wild girl as she sat there in her eternal darkness. She thought of her own desolate fate, far from her native land, far from the bland cares that once assuaged the April sorrows of childhood, deprived of the light of day, with none but strangers to guide her steps, accursed by the one soft feeling of her heart, loving and without hope, save the dim and unholy ray which shot across her mind, as her Thessalian fancies questioned of the force of spells and the gifts of magic. Nature had sown in the heart of this poor girl the seeds of virtue never destined to ripen. The lessons of adversity were not always salutary. Sometimes they softened and amend, but as often they indurate and pervert. If we consider ourselves more harshly treated by fate than those around us, and do not acknowledge in our own deeds the justice of the severity, we become too apt to deem the world our enemy, to case ourselves in defiance, to wrestle against our softer self, and to indulge the darker passions which are so easily fermented by the sense of injustice. Sold early into slavery, sentenced to a sordid taskmaster, exchanging her situation, only yet more to embitter her lot, the kindlier feelings, naturally profuse in the breast of Nydia, were nipped and blighted. Her sense of right and wrong was confused by a passion to which she had so madly surrendered herself, and the same intense and tragic emotions which we read of in the women of the classic age, a Mira, a Medea, and which hurried and swept away the whole soul when once delivered to love, ruled and rioted in her breast. Time passed. A light step entered the chamber where Nydia yet indulged her gloomy meditations. "Oh, thanked be the immortal gods," said Julia. "I have returned. I have left that terrible cavern. Come, Nydia, let us away forthwith." It was not till they were seated in the litter that Julia spoke again. "Oh," she said, tremblingly, "such a scene! Such fearful incantations! And the dead face of the hag! But let us talk not of it. I have obtained the potion. She pledges its effect. My rival shall be suddenly indifferent to his eye, and I alone, the idol of Glaucus." "Glaucus!" exclaimed Nydia. "Aye, I told thee, girl, at first, that it was not the Athenian whom I loved, but I see now that I may trust thee wholly. It is the beautiful Greek." What then were Nydia's emotions? She had connived, she had assisted, in tearing Glaucus from Ione, but only to transfer, by all the power of magic, his affections yet more hopelessly to another. Her heart swelled almost to suffocation. She gasped for breath. In the darkness of the vehicle, Julia did not perceive the agitation of her companion. She went on rapidly dilating on the promised effect of her acquisition, and on her approaching triumph over Ione, every now and then abruptly digressing to the horror of the scene she had quitted, the unmoved mien of Arbaces, and his authority over the dreadful saga. Meanwhile Nydia recovered her self-possession. A thought flashed across her. She slept in the chamber of Julia. She might possess herself of the potion. They arrived at the house of Diomed, and descended to Julia's apartment, where the night's repast awaited them. "Drink, Nydia. Thou must be cold. The air was chill tonight. As for me, my veins are yet ice." And Julia unhesitatingly quaffed deep draughts of the spiced wine. "Thou hast the potion," said Nydia. "Let me hold it in my hands. How small the phial is! Of what color is the draught?" "Clear as crystal," replied Julia, as she retook the philter. "Thou couldst not tell it from this water. The witch assures me it is tasteless. Small though the phial, it suffices for a life's fidelity. It is to be poured into any liquid, and Glaucus will only know what he has quaffed by the effect." "Exactly like this water in appearance?" "Yes, sparkling and colorless as this. How bright it seems! It is as the very essence of moonlit dews. Bright thing, how thou shinest on my hopes through thy crystal vase! And how is it sealed?" "But by one little stopper. I withdraw it now. The draught gives no odor. Strange, that that which speaks to neither sense should thus command all." "Is the effect instantaneous?" "Usually, but sometimes it remains dormant for a few hours." "Oh, how sweet is this perfume!" said Nydia suddenly, as she took up a small bottle on the table, and bent over its fragrant contents. "Thinkest thou so? The bottle is set with gems of some value. Thou wouldst not have the bracelet yestermorn. Wilt thou take the bottle?" "It ought to be such perfumes as these that should remind one who cannot see of the generous Julia, if the bottle be not too costly." "Oh, I have 1,000 costlier ones. Take it, child." Nydia bowed her gratitude and placed the bottle in her vest. "And the draught would be equally efficacious, whoever administers it?" "If the most hideous hag beneath the sun bestowed it, such is its asserted virtue that Glaucus would deem her beautiful, and none but her." Julia, warmed by the wine and the reaction of her spirits, was now all animation and delight. She laughed loud, and talked on 100 matters. Nor was it till the night had advanced far towards morning that she summoned her slaves and undressed. When they were dismissed, she said to Nydia, "I will not suffer this holy draught to quit my presence till the hour comes for its use. Lie under my pillow, bright spirit, and give me happy dreams." So saying, she placed the potion under her pillow. Nydia's heart beat violently. "Why dost thou drink that unmixed water, Nydia? Take the wine by its side." "I am fevered," replied the blind girl, "and the water cools me. I will place this bottle by my bedside. It refreshes in these summer nights, when the dews of sleep fall not on our lips." "Fair Julia, I must leave thee very early, so Ione bids, perhaps before thou art awake. Accept therefore now my congratulations." "Thanks. When next we meet you may find Glaucus at my feet." They had retired to their couches, and Julia, worn out by the excitement of the day, soon slept. But anxious and burning thoughts rolled over the mind of the wakeful Thessalian. She listened to the calm breathing of Julia, and her ear, accustomed to the finest distinctions of sound, speedily assured her of the deep slumber of her companion. "Now befriend me, Venus," she said softly. She rose gently, and poured the perfume from the gift of Julia upon the marble floor. She rinsed it several times carefully with the water that was beside her, and then easily finding the bed of Julia, for night to her was as day, she pressed her trembling hand under the pillow and seized the potion. Julia stirred not. Her breath regularly fanned the burning cheek of the blind girl. Nydia then, opening the phial, poured its contents into the bottle, which easily contained them, and then refilling the former reservoir of the potion with that limpid water which Julia had assured her it so resembled, she once more placed the phial in its former place. She then stole again to her couch, and waited. With what thoughts? The dawning day. The sun had risen. Julia slept still. Nydia noiselessly dressed herself, placed her treasure carefully in her vest, took up her staff, and hastened to quit the house. The porter, Medon, saluted her kindly as she descended the steps that led to the street. She heard him not. Her mind was confused and lost in the whirl of tumultuous thoughts, each thought a passion. She felt the pure morning air upon her cheek, but it cooled not her scorching veins. "Glaucus," she murmured, "all the love charms of the wildest magic could not make thee love me as I love thee. Ione! Ah, away hesitation, away remorse! Glaucus, my fate is in thy smile, and thine hope. O joy, O transport, thy fate is in these hands." End of Book 3, Chapter 11.
Book 4, Chapter 1 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 1. Reflections on the zeal of the early Christians. Two men come to a perilous resolve. Walls have ears, particularly sacred walls. Whoever regards the early history of Christianity will perceive how necessary to its triumph was that fierce spirit of zeal, which, fearing no danger, accepting no compromise, inspired its champions and sustained its martyrs. In a dominant church, the genius of intolerance betrays its cause. In a weak and persecuted church, the same genius mainly supports. It was necessary to scorn, to loathe, to abhor the creeds of other men, in order to conquer the temptations which they presented. It was necessary rigidly to believe not only that the gospel was the true faith, but the sole truth faith that saved, in order to nerve the disciple to the austerity of its doctrine, and to encourage him to the sacred and perilous chivalry of converting the polytheist and the heathen. The sectarian sternness which confined virtue and heaven to a chosen few, which saw demons in other gods and the penalties of hell in other religions, made the believer naturally anxious to convert all to whom he felt the ties of human affection, and the circle thus traced by benevolence to man was yet more widened by a desire for the glory of God. It was for the honor of the Christian faith that the Christian boldly forced its tenets upon the skepticism of some, the repugnance of others, the sage contempt of the philosopher, the pious shudder of the people. His very intolerance supplied him with his fittest instruments of success, and the soft heathen began at last to imagine there must indeed be something holy in a zeal wholly foreign to his experience, which stopped at no obstacle, dreaded no danger, and even at the torture or on the scaffold referred a dispute far other than the calm differences of speculative philosophy to the tribunal of an eternal judge. It was thus that the same fervour which made the churchman of the Middle Age a bigot without mercy made the Christian of the early days a hero without fear. Of these more fiery, daring, and earnest natures, not the least ardent was Olynthus. No sooner had Apicides been received by the rites of baptism into the bosom of the church than the Nazarene hastened to make him conscious of the impossibility to retain the office and robes of priesthood. He could not, it was evident, profess to worship God and continue even outwardly to honour the idolatrous altars of the fiend. Nor was this all. The sanguine and impetuous mind of Olynthus beheld in the power of Apicides the means of divulging to the deluded people the juggling mysteries of the oracular Isis. He thought heaven had sent this instrument of his design in order to disabuse the eyes of the crowd and prepare the way, perchance, for the conversion of a whole city. He did not hesitate then to appeal to all the new-kindled enthusiasm of Apicides to arouse his courage and to stimulate his zeal. They met, according to previous agreement, the evening after the baptism of Apicides, in the grove of Cybele, which we have before described. At the next solemn consultation of the oracle, said Olynthus, as he proceeded in the warmth of his address, advance yourself to the railing, proclaim aloud to the people the deception they endure, invite them to enter, to be themselves the witness of the gross but artful mechanism of imposture thou hast described to me. Fear not, the Lord who protected Daniel shall protect thee. We, the community of Christians, will be amongst the crowd. We will urge on the shrinking, and in the first flush of the popular indignation and shame, I myself, upon those very altars, will plant the palm branch typical of the gospel, and to my tongue shall descend the rushing spirit of the living God. Heated and excited as he was, this suggestion was not unpleasing to Apicides. He was rejoiced at so early an opportunity of distinguishing his faith in his new sect, and to his holier feelings were added those of a vindictive loathing at the imposition he had himself suffered, and a desire to avenge it. In that sanguine and elastic overbound of obstacles, the rashness necessary to all who undertake venturous and lofty actions, neither Olynthus nor the proselyte perceived the impediments to the success of their scheme, which might be found in the reverent superstition of the people themselves, who would probably be loath, before the sacred altars of the great Egyptian goddess, to believe even the testimony of her priest against her power. Apicides then assented to this proposal with a readiness which delighted Olynthus. They parted with the understanding that Olynthus should confer with the more important of his Christian brethren on his great enterprise, should receive their advice and their assurances of the support on the eventful day. It so chanced that one of the festivals of Isis was to be held on the second day after this conference. The festival proffered a ready occasion for the design. They appointed to meet once more on the next evening at the same spot, and in that meeting were finally to be settled the order and details of the disclosure for the following day. It happened that the later part of this conference had been held near the sacellum, or small chapel, which I have described in the early part of this work. And so soon as the forms of the Christian and the priest had disappeared from the grove, a dark and ungainly figure emerged from behind the chapel. "I have tracked you with some effect, my brother Flamen," soliloquized the eavesdropper. "You, the priest of Isis, have not for mere idle discussion conferred with this gloomy Christian. Alas, that I could not hear all your precious plot. Enough, I find at least, that you meditate revealing the sacred mysteries, and that tomorrow you meet again at this place to plan the how and the when. May Osiris sharpen my ears then, to detect the whole of your unheard-of audacity. When I have learned more, I must confer at once with Arbaces. We will frustrate you, my friends, deep as you think yourselves. At present my breast is a locked treasury of your secret." Thus muttering, Calenus, for it was he, wrapped his robe around him and strode thoughtfully homeward. End of chapter 1. Book 4, Chapter 2 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 2. A classic host, cook, and kitchen. Apicides seeks Ione, their conversation. It was then that the day for Diomed's banquet to the most select of his friends, the graceful Glaucus, the beautiful Ione, the official Pansa, the high-born Clodius, the immortal Fulvius, the exquisite Lepidus, the Epicurean Sallust, were not the only honourers of his festival. He expected also an invalid senator from Rome, a man of considerable repute and favour at court, and a great warrior from Herculaneum, who had fought with Titus against the Jews, and having enriched himself prodigiously in the wars, was always told by his friends that his country was eternally indebted to his disinterested exertions. The party, however, extended to a yet greater number, for although critically speaking it was at one time thought inelegant among the Romans to entertain less than 3 or more than 9 at their banquets, yet this rule was easily disregarded by the ostentatious. And we are told, indeed, in history, that one of the most splendid of these entertainers usually feasted a select party of 300. Diomed, however, more modest, contented himself with doubling the number of the Muses. His party consisted of 18, no unfashionable number in the present day. It was the morning of Diomed's banquet, and Diomed himself, though he greatly affected the gentleman and the scholar, retained enough of his mercantile experience to know that a master's eye makes a ready servant. Accordingly, with his tunic ungirdled on his portly stomach, his easy slippers on his feet, a small wand in his hand, wherewith he now directed the gaze and now corrected the back of some duller menial, he went from chamber to chamber of his costly villa. He did not disdain even a visit to that sacred apartment in which the priests of the festival prepare their offerings. On entering the kitchen, his ears were agreeably stunned by the noise of dishes and pans, of oaths and commands. Small as this indispensable chamber seems to have been in all the houses of Pompeii, it was, nevertheless, usually fitted up with all that amazing variety of stoves and shapes, stew pans and saucepans, cutters and moulds, without which a cook of spirit, no matter whether he be an ancient or a modern, declares it utterly impossible that he can give you anything to eat. And as fuel was then, as now, dear and scarce in those regions, great seems to have been the dexterity exercised in preparing as many things as possible with as little fire. An admirable contrivance of this nature may be still seen in the Neapolitan Museum, viz. A portable kitchen about the size of a folio volume, containing stoves for 4 dishes and an apparatus for heating water or other beverages. Across the small kitchen flitted many forms which the quick eye of the master did not recognize. Oh, grumbled he to himself, that cursed Congrio hath invited a whole legion of cooks to assist him. They won't serve for nothing, and this is another item in the total of my day's expenses. By Bacchus, thrice lucky shall I be if the slaves do not help themselves to some of the drinking vessels. Ready, alas, are their hands, capacious are their tunics. Me miserum. The cooks, however, worked on, seemingly heedless of the apparition of Diomed. Ho, Euclio, your egg pan. What, is this the largest? It only holds 33 eggs. In the houses I usually serve, the smallest egg pan holds 50, if need be. The unconscionable rogue, thought Diomed. He talks of eggs as if they were a sesterce 100. "By Mercury," cried a pert little culinary disciple, scarce in his novitiate, "whoever saw such antique sweatmeat shapes as these? It is impossible to do credit to one's art with such rude materials. Why, Sallust's commonest sweetmeat shape represents the whole siege of Troy, Hector and Paris, and Helen, with little Astyanax and the wooden horse into the bargain." "Silence, fool," said Congrio, the cook of the house, who seemed to leave the chief part of the battle to his allies. "My master Diomed is not one of those expensive good-for-noughts, who must have the last fashion, cost what it will." "Thou liest, base slave," cried Diomed in a great passion, "and thou costest me already enough to have ruined Lucullus himself. Come out of thy den, I want to talk to thee." The slave, with a sly wink at his confederates, obeyed the command. "Man of 3 letters," said Diomed, with his face of solemn anger, "how didst thou dare to invite all those rascals into my house? I see thief written in every line of their faces." "Yet I assure you, master, that they are men of most respectable character, the best cooks of the place. It is a great favor to get them, but for my sake—" "Thy sake, unhappy Congrio," interrupted Diomed, "and by what purloined moneys of mine, by what reserved filchings from marketing, by what goodly meats converted into grease and sold in the suburbs, by what false charges for bronzes marred and earthenware broken, hast thou been enabled to make them serve thee for thy sake?" "Nay, master, do not impeach my honesty. May the gods desert me if—" "Swear not again," interrupted the choleric Diomed, "for then the gods will smite thee for a perjurer, and I shall lose my cook on the eve of dinner. But enough of this at present. Keep a sharp eye on thy ill-favored assistants, and tell me no tales tomorrow of vases broken and cups miraculously vanished, or thy whole back shall be one pain. And hark thee, thou knowest thou hast made me pay for those Phrygian attachants enough, by Hercules, to have feasted a sober man for a year together. See that they be not one iota over-roasted. The last time, O Congrio, that I gave a banquet to my friends, when thy vanity did so boldly undertake the becoming appearance of a Melian crane, thou knowest it came up like a stone from Aetna, as if all the fires of Phlegethon had been scorching out its juices. Be modest this time, Congrio, wary and modest. Modesty is the nurse of great actions, and in all other things, as in this, if thou wilt not spare thy master's purse, at least consult thy master's glory. There shall not be such a coena seen at Pompeii since the days of Hercules. Softly, softly, thy cursed boasting again. But I say, Congrio, yon homunculus, yon pygmy assailant of my cranes, yon pert-tongued neophyte of the kitchen, was there aught but insolence on his tongue when he maligned the comeliness of my sweetmeat shapes? I would not be out of the fashion, Congrio. "It is but the custom of us cooks," replied Congrio gravely, "to undervalue our tools in order to increase the effect of our art. The sweetmeat shape is a fair shape and a lovely, but I would recommend my master, at the first occasion, to purchase some new ones of a—" "That will suffice," exclaimed Diomed, who seemed resolved never to allow his slave to finish his sentences. "Now resume thy charge, shine, eclipse thyself. Let men envy Diomed his cook, let the slaves of Pompeii style thee Congrio the Great. Go. Yet stay, thou hast not spent all the moneys I gave thee for the marketing?" "All? Alas, the nightingales' tongues, and the Roman temacula, and the oysters from Britain, and sundry other things, too numerous now to recite, are yet left unpaid for. But what matter? Everyone trusts the Archimagirus of Diomed the Wealthy." "O unconscionable prodigal, what waste, what profusion! I am ruined! But go, hasten, inspect, taste, perform, surpass thyself. Let the Roman senator not despise the poor Pompeian. Away, slave, and remember the Phrygian attigans." The chief disappeared within his natural domain, and Diomed rolled back his portly presence to the more courtly chambers. All was to his liking. The flowers were fresh, the fountains played briskly, the mosaic pavements were as smooth as mirrors. "Where is my daughter Julia?" he asked. "At the bath." "Ah, that reminds me. Time wanes, and I must bathe also." Our story returns to Apicides. On awaking that day from the broken and feverish sleep which had followed his adoption of a faith so strikingly and sternly at variance with that in which his youth had been nurtured, the young priest could scarcely imagine that he was not yet in a dream. He had crossed the fatal river. The past was henceforth to have no sympathy with the future. The two worlds were distinct and separate, that which had been from that which was to be. To what a bold and adventurous enterprise he had pledged his life, to unveil the mysteries in which he had participated, to desecrate the altars he had served, to denounce the goddess whose ministering robe he wore. Slowly he became sensible of the hatred and the horror he should provoke amongst the pious, even if successful. If frustrated in his daring attempt, what penalties might he not incur for an offense hitherto unheard of, for which no specific law, derived from experience, was prepared? And which, for that very reason, precedents dragged from the sharpest armory of obsolete and inapplicable legislation would probably be distorted to meet. His friends, the sister of his youth, could he expect justice, though he might receive compassion, from them? This brave and heroic act would by their heathen eyes be regarded, perhaps, as a heinous apostasy, at the best as a pitiable madness. He renounced everything in this world in the hope of securing that eternity in the next which had so suddenly been revealed to him. While these thoughts on the one hand invaded his breast, on the other hand his pride, his courage, and his virtue mingled with reminiscences of revenge for deceit, of indignant disgust at fraud, conspired to raise and to support him. The conflict was sharp and keen, but his new feelings triumphed over his old, and a mighty argument in favor of wrestling with the sanctities of old opinions and hereditary forms might be found in the conquest over both, achieved by that humble priest. Had the early Christians been more controlled by the solemn plausibilities of custom, less of democrats in the pure and lofty acceptation of that perverted word, Christianity would have perished in its cradle. As each priest in succession slept several nights together in the chambers of the temple, the term imposed on Apicides was not yet completed, and when he had risen from his couch, attired himself as usual in his robes, and left his narrow chamber, he found himself before the altars of the temple. In the exhaustion of his late emotions he had slept far into the morning, and the vertical sun already poured its fervid beams over the sacred place. "Salve, Apicides," said a voice whose natural asperity was smoothed by long artifice into an almost displeasing softness of tone. "Thou art late abroad. Has the goddess revealed herself to thee in visions?" "Could she reveal her true self to the people, Calenus? How insenseless would be these altars?" "That," replied Calenus, "may possibly be true, but the deity is wise enough to hold commune with none but priests. A time may come when she will be unveiled without her own acquiescence." "It is not likely. She has triumphed for countless ages, and that which has so long stood the test of time rarely succumbs to the lust of novelty. But hark ye, young brother, these sayings are indiscreet." "It is not for thee to silence them," replied Apicides, haughtily. "So hot, yet I will not quarrel with thee. Why, my Apicides, has not the Egyptian convinced thee of the necessity of our dwelling together in unity? Has he not convinced thee of the wisdom of deluding the people and enjoying ourselves? If not, oh brother, he is not that great magician he is esteemed." "Thou, then, hast shared his lessons?" said Apicides with a hollow smile. "Ay, but I stood less in need of them than thou. Nature had already gifted me with the love of pleasure and the desire of gain and power. Long is the way that leads the voluptuary to the severities of life, but it is only one step from pleasant sin to sheltering hypocrisy. Beware the vengeance of the goddess, if the shortness of that step be disclosed." "Beware thou the hour when the tomb shall be rent and the rottenness exposed," returned Apicides solemnly. "Vale." With these words he left the flamen to his meditations. When he got a few paces from the temple, he turned to look back. Calenus had already disappeared in the entry room of the priests, for it now approached the hour of that repast which, called prandium by the ancients, answers in point of date to the breakfast of the moderns. The white and graceful fane gleamed brightly in the sun. Upon the altars before it rose the incense and bloomed the garlands. The priest gazed long and wistfully upon the scene. It was the last time that it was ever beheld by him. He then turned and pursued his way slowly towards the house of Ione, for before possibly the last tie that united them was cut in twain, before the uncertain peril of the next day was incurred, he was anxious to see his last surviving relative, his fondest as his earliest friend. He arrived at her house and found her in the garden with Nydia. "This is kind, Apicides," said Ione joyfully, "and how eagerly have I wished to see thee. What thanks do I not owe thee? How churlish hast thou been to answer none of my letters, to abstain from coming hither to receive the expressions of my gratitude. Oh, thou hast assisted to preserve thy sister from dishonor. What can she say to thank thee, now thou art come at last?" "My sweet Ione, thou owest me no gratitude, for thy cause was mine. Let us avoid that subject. Let us recur not to that impious man. How hateful to both of us! I may have a speedy opportunity to teach the world the nature of his pretended wisdom and hypocritical severity. But let us sit down, my sister. I am wearied with the heat of the sun. Let us sit in yonder shade, and, for a little while longer, be to each other what we have been." Beneath a wide plane tree, with the cistus and the arbutus clustering round them, the living fountain before, the greensward beneath their feet, the gay cicada, once so dear to Athens, rising merrily ever and anon amidst the grass, the butterfly, beautiful emblem of the soul, dedicated to Psyche, and which has continued to furnish illustrations to the Christian bard, rich in the glowing colors caught from Sicilian skies, hovering about the sunny flowers, itself like a winged flower, in this spot and this scene the brother and the sister sat together for the last time on earth. You may tread now on the same place, but the garden is no more, the columns are shattered, the fountain has ceased to play. Let the traveller search amongst the ruins of Pompeii for the house of Ione. Its remains are yet visible, but I will not betray them to the gaze of commonplace tourists. He who is more sensitive than the herd will discover them easily. When he has done so, let him keep the secret." They sat down, and Nydia, glad to be alone, retired to the farther end of the garden. "Ione, my sister," said the young convert, "place your hand upon my brow. Let me feel your cool touch. Speak to me, too, for your gentle voice is like a breeze that hath freshness as well as music. Speak to me, but forbear to bless me. Utter not one word of those forms of speech which our childhood was taught to consider sacred." Alas, and what then shall I say? Our language of affection is so woven with that of worship that the words grow chilled and trite if I banish from them allusion to our gods. "Our gods," murmured Apicides with a shudder. "Thou slightest my request already." "Shall I speak then to thee only of Isis?" "The evil spirit? No, rather be dumb for ever, unless at least thou canst. But away, away this talk. Not now will we dispute and cavil. Not now will we judge harshly of each other. Thou, regarding me as an apostate, and I all sorrow and shame for thee as an idolater. No, my sister, let us avoid such topics and such thoughts. In thy sweet presence a calm falls over my spirit. For a little while I forget. As I thus lay my temples on thy bosom, as I thus feel thy gentle arm embrace me, I think that we are children once more, and that the heaven smiles equally upon both. For oh, if hereafter I escape, no matter what peril, and it be permitted me to address thee on one sacred and awful subject, should I find thine ear closed and thy heart hardened, what hope for myself could countervail the despair for thee? In thee, my sister, I behold a likeness made beautiful, made noble, of myself. Shall the mirror live forever, and the form itself be broken as the potter's clay? Ah, no, no. Thou wilt listen to me yet. Dost thou remember how we went into the fields by Baiae, hand in hand together, to pluck the flowers of spring? Even so, hand in hand, shall we enter the eternal garden, and crown ourselves with imperishable asphodel. Wondering and bewildered by words she could not comprehend, but excited even to tears by the plaintiveness of their tone, Ione listened to these outpourings of a full and oppressed heart. In truth, Apicides himself was softened much beyond his ordinary mood, which to outward seeming was usually either sullen or impetuous. For the noblest desires are of a jealous nature, they engross, they absorb the soul, and often leave the splenetic humours stagnant and unheeded at the surface. Unheeding the petty things around us, we are deemed morose; impatient at earthly interruption to the diviner dreams, we are thought irritable and churlish. For as there is no chimera vainer than the hope that one human heart shall find sympathy in another, so none ever interrupt us with justice, and none, no, not our nearest and our dearest ties, forbear with us in mercy. When we are dead and repentance comes too late, both friend and foe may wonder to think how little there was in us to forgive. "I will talk to thee then of our early years," said Ione. "Shall yon blind girl sing to thee of the days of childhood? Her voice is sweet and musical, and she hath a song on that theme which contains none of those allusions it pains thee to hear." "Dost thou remember the words, my sister?" asked Apicides. "Methinks yes, for the tune, which is simple, fixed them on my memory." "Sing to me then thyself. My ear is not in unison with unfamiliar voices, and thine, Ione, full of household associations, has ever been to me more sweet than all the hireling melodies of Lycia or of Crete. Sing to me." Ione beckoned to a slave that stood in the portico, and sending for her lute, sang, when it arrived, to a tender and simple air, the following verses: REGRETS for Childhood. It is not that our earlier heaven escapes its April showers, or that to childhood's heart is given no snake amidst the flowers. Ah, twined with grief, each brightest leaf that's wreathed us by the hours. Young though we be, the past may sting, the present feed its sorrow, but hope shines bright on everything that waits us with the morrow. Like sunlight glades, the dimmest shades some rosy beam can borrow. It is not that our later years of cares are woven wholly, but smiles less swiftly chase the tears, and wounds are healed more slowly, and memory's vow to lost ones now makes joys too bright unholy. And ever fled the iris bow that smiled when clouds were o'er us. If storms should burst, uncheered we go, a drearier waste before us, and with the toys of childish joys we've broke the staff that bore us. Wisely and delicately had Ione chosen that song, sad though its burthen seemed. For when we are deeply mournful, discordant above all others is the voice of mirth. The fittest spell is that borrowed from melancholy itself, for dark thoughts can be softened down when they cannot be brightened, and so they lose the precise and rigid outline of their truth, and their colours melt into the ideal. as the leech applies in remedy to the internal sore some outward irritation, which by a gentler wound draws away the venom of that which is more deadly, thus in the rankling festers of the mind our art is to divert to a milder sadness on the surface the pain that gnaweth at the core. And so with Apicides, yielding to the influence of the silver voice that reminded him of the past, and told but of half the sorrow borne to the present, he forgot his more immediate and fiery sources of anxious thought. He spent hours in making Ione alternately sing to and converse with him, and when he rose to leave her, it was with a calm and lulled mind. "Ione," said he, as he pressed her hand, "should you hear my name blackened and maligned, will you credit the aspersion?" "Never, my brother, never." "Dost thou not imagine, according to thy belief, that the evildoer is punished hereafter and the good rewarded?" "Can you doubt it?" "Dost thou think, then, that he who is truly good should sacrifice every selfish interest in his zeal for virtue? He who doth so is the equal of the gods. And thou believest that, according to the purity and courage with which he thus acts, shall be his portion of bliss beyond the grave?" "So we are taught to hope." "Kiss me, my sister. One question more. Thou art to be wedded to Glaucus. Perchance that marriage may separate us more hopelessly, but not of this speak I now. Thou art to be married to Glaucus. Dost thou love him? Nay, my sister, answer me by words." "Yes," murmured Ione, blushing. "Dost thou feel that, for his sake, thou couldst renounce pride, brave dishonor, and incur death? I have heard that when women really love, it is to that excess." "My brother, all this I could do for Glaucus, and feel that it were not a sacrifice. There is no sacrifice to those who love, in what is borne for the one we love." "Enough! Shall woman feel thus for man, and man feel less devotion to his God?" He spoke no more. His whole countenance seemed instinct and inspired with a divine life. His chest swelled proudly. His eyes glowed. On his forehead was writ the majesty of a man who can dare to be noble. He turned to meet the eyes of Ione, earnest, wistful, fearful. He kissed her fondly, strained her warmly to his breast, and in a moment more he had left the house. Long did Ione remain in the same place, mute and thoughtful. The maidens again and again came to warn her of the deepening noon, and her engagement to Diomed's banquet. At length she woke from her reverie, and prepared, not with the pride of beauty, but listless and melancholy, for the festival. One thought alone reconciled her to the promised visit. She should meet Glaucus. She could confide to him her alarm and uneasiness for her brother. End of chapter 2. Book 4, Chapter 3 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 3. A fashionable party and a dinner a la mode in Pompeii. Meanwhile, Sallust and Glaucus were slowly strolling towards the house of Diomed. Despite the habits of his life, Sallust was not devoid of many estimable qualities. He would have been an active friend, a useful citizen, in short, an excellent man, if he had not taken it into his head to be a philosopher. Brought up in the schools in which Roman plagiarism worshipped the echo of Grecian wisdom, he had imbued himself with those doctrines by which the later Epicureans corrupted the simple maxims of their great master. He gave himself altogether up to pleasure, and imagined there was no sage like a boon companion. Still, however, he had a considerable degree of learning, wit, and good nature, and the hearty frankness of his very vices seemed like virtue itself beside the utter corruption of Clodius and the prostrate effeminacy of Lepidus, and therefore Glaucus liked him the best of his companions, and he, in turn, appreciating the nobler qualities of the Athenian, loved him almost as much as a cold Murena or a bowl of the best Falernian. "This is a vulgar old fellow, this Diomed," said Sallust, "but he has some good qualities in his cellar, and some charming ones in his daughter." "True, Glaucus, but you are not much moved by them, methinks. I fancy Clodius is desirous to be your successor." "He is welcome. At the banquet of Julia's beauty, no guest, be sure, is considered a musker." "You are severe, but she has, indeed, something of the Corinthian about her. They will be well matched, after all. What good-natured fellows we are to associate with that gambling good-for-naught." "Pleasure unites strange varieties," answered Glaucus. "He amuses me." "And flatters, but then he pays himself well. He powders his praise with gold dust." "You often hint that he plays unfairly. Think you so really?" "My dear Glaucus, a Roman noble has his dignity to keep up. Dignity is very expensive. Clodius must cheat like a scoundrel in order to live like a gentleman." Ha ha! Well, of late I have renounced the dice. Ah, Sallust, when I am wedded to Ione, I trust I may yet redeem a youth of follies. We are both born for better things than those in which we sympathize now, born to render our worship in nobler temples than the sty of Epicurus. Alas, returned Sallust in rather a melancholy tone, what do we know more than this? Life is short. Beyond the grave all is dark. There is no wisdom like that which says, enjoy. By Bacchus, I doubt sometimes if we do enjoy the utmost of which life is capable. I am a moderate man, returned Sallust, and do not ask the utmost. We are like malefactors, and intoxicate ourselves with wine and myrrh as we stand on the brink of death. But if we did not do so, the abyss would look very disagreeable. I own that I was inclined to be gloomy until I took so heartily to drinking. That is a new life, my Glaucus. Yes, but it brings us next morning to a new death. Why, the next morning is unpleasant, I own, but then, if it were not so, one would never be inclined to read. I study betimes, because, by the gods, I am generally unfit for anything else till noon. Fie, Scythian! Pshaw, the fate of Pentheus to him who denies Bacchus. Well, Sallust, with all your faults, you are the best profligate I ever met, and verily, if I were in danger of life, you are the only man in all Italy who would stretch out a finger to save me. Perhaps I should not if it were in the middle of supper, but in truth we Italians are fearfully selfish. So are all men who are not free, said Glaucus with a sigh. Freedom alone makes men sacrifice to each other. Freedom, then, must be a very fatiguing thing to an Epicurean, answered Sallust, but here we are at our host's. As Diomed's villa is one of the most considerable in point of size of any yet discovered at Pompeii, and is, moreover, built much according to the specific instructions for a suburban villa laid down by the Roman architect, it may not be uninteresting briefly to describe the plan of the apartments through which our visitors passed. They entered, then, by the same small vestibule at which we have before been presented to the aged Medon, and passed at once into a colonnade, technically termed the peristyle, for the main difference between the suburban villa and the town mansion consisted in placing, in the first, the said colonnade in exactly the same place as that which in the town mansion was occupied by the atrium. In the centre of the peristyle was an open court which contained the impluvium. From this peristyle descended a staircase to the offices, another narrow passage on the opposite side communicated with a garden. Various small apartments surrounded the colonnade, appropriated probably to country visitors. Another door to the left on entering communicated with a small triangular portico which belonged to the baths, and behind was the wardrobe in which were kept the vests of the holiday suits of the slaves and perhaps of the master. 17 centuries afterwards were found those relics of ancient finery calcined and crumbling, kept longer, alas, than their thrifty lord foresaw. Return we to the peristyle, and endeavour now to present to the reader a coup d'oeil of the whole suite of apartments which immediately stretched before the steps of the visitors. Let him then first imagine the columns of the portico hung with festoons of flowers, the columns themselves in the lower part painted red, and the walls around glowing with various frescoes. Then, looking beyond a curtain, 3 parts drawn aside, the eye caught the tablinum, or saloon, which was closed at will by glazed doors, now slid back into the walls. On either side of this tablinum were small rooms, one of which was a kind of cabinet of gems, and these apartments, as well as the tablinum, communicated with a long gallery, which opened at either end upon terraces. And between the terraces, and communicating with the central part of the gallery, was a hall, in which the banquet was that day prepared. All these apartments, though almost on a level with the street, were 1 story above the garden, and the terraces communicating with the gallery were continued into corridors raised above the pillars which, to the right and left, skirted the garden below. Beneath, and on a level with the garden, ran the apartments we have already described as chiefly appropriated to Julia. In the gallery, then, just mentioned, Diomed received his guests. The merchant affected greatly the man of letters, and therefore he also affected a passion for everything Greek. He paid particular attention to Glaucus. "You will see, my friend," said he, with a wave of his hand, "that I am a little classical here, a little Cecropian, eh? The hall in which we shall sup is borrowed from the Greeks. It is an aecus Cyzicene. Noble Sallust, they have not, I am told, this sort of apartment in Rome." "Oh," replied Sallust, with a half smile, "you Pompeians combine all that is most eligible in Greece and in Rome. May you, Diomed, combine the viands as well as the architecture." You shall see, my Sallust," replied the merchant. "We have a taste at Pompeii, and we have also money." "They are 2 excellent things," replied Sallust. "But behold, the Lady Julia." The main difference, as I have before remarked, in the manner of life observed among the Athenians and Romans, was that with the first the modest woman rarely or never took part in entertainments; with the latter they were the common ornaments of the banquet, but when they were present at the feast it usually terminated at an early hour. Magnificently robed in white, interwoven with pearls and threads of gold, the handsome Julia entered the apartment. Scarcely had she received the salutation of the two guests ere Pansa and his wife, Lepidus, Clodius, and the Roman senator entered almost simultaneously. Then came the widow Fulvia, then the poet Fulvius, like to the widow in name if in nothing else. The warrior from Herculaneum, accompanied by his Umbra, next stalked in, afterwards the less eminent of the guests. Ione yet tarried. It was the mode among the courteous ancients to flatter whenever it was in their power; accordingly it was a sign of ill breeding to seat themselves immediately on entering the house of their host. After performing the salutation, which was usually accomplished by the same cordial shake of the right hand which we ourselves retain, and sometimes by the yet more familiar embrace, they spent several minutes in surveying the apartment and admiring the bronzes, the pictures, or the furniture with which it was adorned, a mode very impolite according to our refined English notions, which place good breeding in indifference. We would not for the world express much admiration of another man's house, for fear it should be thought we had never seen anything so fine before. "A beautiful statue this of Bacchus," said the Roman senator. "A mere trifle," replied Diomed. "What charming paintings," said Fulvia. "Mere trifles," answered the owner. "Exquisite candelabra," cried the warrior. "Exquisite," echoed his Umbra. "Trifles, trifles," reiterated the merchant. Meanwhile Glaucus found himself by one of the windows of the gallery, which communicated with the terraces, and the fair Julia by his side. "Is it an Athenian virtue, Glaucus," said the merchant's daughter, "to shun those whom we once sought?" "Fair Julia, no." "Yet methinks it is one of the qualities of Glaucus." "Glaucus never shuns a friend," replied the Greek, with some emphasis on the last word. "May Julia rank among the number of his friends?" "It would be an honor to the emperor to find a friend in one so lovely." "You evade my question," returned the enamored Julia. "But tell me, is it true that you admire the Neapolitan Ione?" "Does not beauty constrain our admiration?" "Ah, subtle Greek, still do you fly the meaning of my words. But say, shall Julia be indeed your friend?" "If she will so favor me, blessed be the gods, the day in which I am thus honored shall be ever marked in white." Yet even while you speak your eye is resting, your color comes and goes, you move away involuntarily, you are impatient to join Ione. For at that moment Ione had entered, and Glaucus had indeed betrayed the emotion noticed by the jealous beauty. "Can admiration to one woman make me unworthy the friendship of another? Sanction not so, O Julia, the libels of the poets on your sex." "Well, you are right, or I will learn to think so. Glaucus, yet one moment. You are to wed Ione, is it not so?" "If the fates permit, such is my blessed hope." "Accept then from me, in token of our new friendship, a present for your bride. Nay, it is the custom of friends, you know, always to present to bride and bridegroom some such little marks of their esteem and favoring wishes." "Julia, I cannot refuse any token of friendship from one like you. I will accept the gift as an omen from Fortune herself." "Then, after the feast, when the guests retire, you will descend with me to my apartment and receive it from my hands. Remember," said Julia, as she joined the wife of Pansa, and left Glaucus to seek Ione. The widow Fulvia and the spouse of the aedile were engaged in high and grave discussion. "Oh, Fulvia, I assure you that the last account from Rome declares that the frizzling mode of dressing the hair is growing antiquated. They only now wear it built up in a tower, like Julia's, or arranged as a helmet, the Gallerian fashion, like mine, you see. It has a fine effect, I think. I assure you, Vespius was the name of the Herculaneum hero, admires it greatly. And nobody wears the hair like yon Neapolitan in the Greek way. What, parted in front with the knot behind? Oh no, how ridiculous it is. It reminds one of the statue of Diana. Yet this Ione is handsome, eh?" "So the men say, but then she is rich. She is to marry the Athenian. I wish her joy. He will not be long faithful, I suspect. Those foreigners are very faithless." "Oh, Julia," said Fulvia, as the merchant's daughter joined them, "have you seen the tiger yet?" "No." "Why, all the ladies have been to see him. He is so handsome." "I hope we shall find some criminal or other for him and the lion," replied Julia. "Your husband," turning to Pansa's wife, "is not so active as he should be in this matter." "Why, really, the laws are too mild," replied the dame of the helmet. "There are so few offenses to which the punishment of the arena can be awarded, and then, too, the gladiators are growing effeminate. The stoutest bestiarii declare they are willing enough to fight a boar or a bull, but as for a lion or a tiger, they think the game too much in earnest." "They are worthy of a mitre," replied Julia in disdain. "Oh, have you seen the new house of Fulvius, the dear poet?" said Pansa's wife. No, is it handsome? Very. Such good taste. But they say, my dear, that he has such improper pictures. He won't show them to the women. How ill-bred! Those poets are always odd, said the widow. But he is an interesting man. What pretty verses he writes. We improve very much in poetry. It is impossible to read the old stuff now. I declare I am of your opinion, returned the lady of the helmet. There is so much more force and energy in the modern school. The warrior sauntered up to the ladies. It reconciles me to peace, said he, when I see such faces. Oh, you heroes are ever flatterers, returned Fulvia, hastening to appropriate the compliment specially to herself. By this chain, which I received from the Emperor's own hand, replied the warrior, playing with a short chain which hung around the neck like a collar, instead of descending to the breast, according to the fashion of the peaceful. By this chain you wrong me. I am a blunt man. A soldier should be so. How do you find the ladies of Pompeii generally? Said Julia. By Venus, most beautiful. They favour me a little, it is true, and that inclines my eyes to double their charms. We love a warrior, said the wife of Pansa. I see it, by Hercules. It is even disagreeable to be too celebrated in these cities. At Herculaneum they climb the roof of my atrium to catch a glimpse of me through the compluvium. The admiration of one's citizens is pleasant at first, but burthensome afterwards. True, true, O Vespius, cried the poet, joining the group. I find it so myself. You, said the stately warrior, scanning the small form of the poet with ineffable disdain, in what legion have you served? You may see my spoils, my ex-UVA, in the forum itself, returned the poet, with a significant glance at the women. I have been among the tent companions, the concubinales, of the great Mantuan himself. I know no general from Mantua, said the warrior gravely. What campaign have you served? That of Helicon. I never heard of it. Nay, Vespius, he does but joke, said Julia, laughing. Joke? By Mars, am I a man to be joked? Yes, Mars himself was in love with the mother of jokes, said the poet, a little alarmed. Know then, O Vespius, that I am the poet, Fulvius. It is I who make warriors immortal. The gods forbid, whispered Sallust to Julia. If Vespius were made immortal, what a specimen of tiresome braggadocio would be transmitted to posterity. The soldier looked puzzled, when to the infinite relief of himself and his companions, the signal for the feast was given. As we have already witnessed at the house of Glaucus, the ordinary routine of a Pompeian entertainment, the reader is spared any second detail of the courses, and the manner in which they were introduced. Diomed, who was rather ceremonious, had appointed a nomenclator, or appointer of places, to each guest. The reader understands that the festive board was composed of 3 tables, one at the centre and one at each wing. It was only at the outer side of these tables that the guests reclined. The inner space was left untenanted, for the greater convenience of the waiters or ministry. The extreme corner of one of the wings was appropriated to Julia as the lady of the feast, that next her to Diomed. At one corner of the centre table was placed the aedile, at the opposite corner the Roman senator. These were the posts of honour. The other guests were arranged so that the young, gentleman or lady, should sit next each other, and the more advanced in years be similarly matched. An agreeable provision enough, but one which must often have offended those who wished to be thought still young. The chair of Ione was next to the couch of Glaucus. The seats were veneered with tortoise shell and covered with quilts stuffed with feathers and ornamented with costly embroideries. The modern ornaments of Epernay or Plato were supplied by images of the gods wrought in bronze, ivory, and silver. The sacred salt cellar and the familiar Lares were not forgotten. Over the table and the seats a rich canopy was suspended from the ceiling. At each corner of the table were lofty candelabra, for though it was early noon, the room was darkened, while from tripods placed in different parts of the room distilled the odour of myrrh and frankincense, and upon the abacus, or sideboard, large vases and various ornaments of silver were ranged, much with the same ostentation, but with more than the same taste, that we find displayed at a modern feast. The custom of grace was invariably supplied by that of libations to the gods, and Vesta, as queen of the household gods, usually received first that graceful homage. This ceremony being performed, the slaves showered flowers upon the couches and the floor, and crowned each guest with rosy garlands, intricately woven with ribbons, tied by the rind of the linden tree, and each intermingled with the ivy and the amethyst, supposed preventives against the effect of wine. The wreaths of the women only were exempted from these leaves, for it was not the fashion for them to drink wine in public. It was then that the President Diomed thought it advisable to institute a basilius, or director of the feast, an important office, sometimes chosen by lot, sometimes, as now, by the master of the entertainment. Diomed was not a little puzzled as to his election. The invalid senator was too grave and too infirm for the proper fulfilment of his duty. The ideal Pansa was adequate enough to the task, but then to choose the next in official rank to the senator was an affront to the senator himself. While deliberating between the merits of the others, he caught the mirthful glance of Sallust, and, by a sudden inspiration, named the jovial epicure to the rank of director, or arbiter bibendi. Sallust received the appointment with becoming humility. "I shall be a merciful king," said he, "to those who drink deep. To a recusant, Minos himself shall be less inexorable. Beware." The slaves handed round basins of perfumed water, by which libation the feast commenced, and now the table groaned under the initiatory course. The conversation, at first desultory and scattered, allowed Ione and Glaucus to carry on those sweet whispers which are worth all the eloquence in the world. Julia watched them with flashing eyes. "How soon shall her place be mine?" thought she. But Clodius, who sat in the centre table so as to observe well the countenance of Julia, guessed her pique, and resolved to profit by it. He addressed her across the table in set phrases of gallantry, and as he was of high birth and of a showy person, the vain Julia was not so much in love as to be insensible to his attentions. The slaves, in the interim, were constantly kept upon the alert by the vigilant Sallust, who chased one cup by another with a celerity which seemed as if he were resolved upon exhausting those capacious cellars which the reader may yet see beneath the house of Diomed. The worthy merchant began to repent his choice, as amphora after amphora was pierced and emptied. The slaves, all under the age of manhood, the youngest being about 10 years old, it was they who filled the wine, the eldest some 5 years older mingled it with water, seemed to share in the zeal of Sallust, and the face of Diomed began to glow as he watched the provoking complacency with which they seconded the exertions of the king of the feast. "Pardon me, O senator," said Sallust, "I see you flinch. Your purple hem cannot save you. Drink." "By the gods," said the senator, coughing, "my lungs are already on fire. You proceed with so miraculous a swiftness that Phaeton himself was nothing to you. I am infirm, O pleasant Sallust, you must exonerate me." "Not I, by Vesta. I am an impartial monarch. Drink!" The poor senator, compelled by the laws of the table, was forced to comply. Alas, every cup was bringing him nearer and nearer to the Stygian pool. "Gently, gently, my king," groaned Diomed. "We already begin to—" "Treason!" interrupted Sallust. "No stern Brutus here, no interference with royalty." "But our female guests—" "Lover toper, did not Ariadne dote upon Bacchus?" The feast proceeded. The guests grew more talkative and noisy. The dessert or last course was already on the table, and the slaves bore round water with myrrh and hyssop for the finishing libation. At the same time, a small circular table that had been placed in the space opposite the guests suddenly, and as by magic, seemed to open in the center and cast up a fragrant shower, sprinkling the table and the guests, while, as it ceased, the awning above them was drawn aside, and the guests perceived that a rope had been stretched across the ceiling, and that one of those nimble dancers for which Pompeii was so celebrated, and whose descendants add so charming a grace to the festivities of Astles or Vauxhall, was now treading his airy measures right over their heads. This apparition, removed but by a cord from one's pericranium, and indulging the most vehement leaps, apparently with the intention of alighting upon that cerebral region, would probably be regarded with some terror by a party in Mayfair, but our Pompeian revellers seemed to behold the spectacle with delighted curiosity, and applauded in proportion as the dancer appeared with the most difficulty to miss falling upon the head of whatever guest he particularly selected to dance above. He paid the senator, indeed, the peculiar compliment of literally falling from the rope and catching it again with his hand, just as the whole party imagined the skull of the Roman was as much fractured as ever that of the poet whom the eagle took for a tortoise. At length, to the great relief of at least Ione, who had not much accustomed herself to this entertainment, the dancer suddenly paused as a strain of music was heard from without. He danced again still more wildly, the air changed, the dancer paused again. No, it could not dissolve the charm which was supposed to possess him. He represented one who by a strange disorder is compelled to dance, and whom only a certain air of music can cure. At length the musician seemed to hit on the right tune, the dancer gave one leap, swung himself down from the rope, alighted on the floor, and vanished. One art now yielded to another, and the musicians who were stationed without on the terrace struck up a soft and mellow air, to which were sung the following words, made almost indistinct by the barrier between and the exceeding lowness of the minstrelsy. Festive music should be low. Hark, through these flowers our music sends its greeting to your loved halls, where Silas shuns the day. When the young god his Cretan nymph was meeting, he taught Pan's rustic pipe this gliding lay. Soft as the dews of wine, shed in this banquet hour, the rich libation of sound stream divine, O reverent harp, to Aphrodite pour. Wild rings the trump o'er ranks to glory marching, music's sublimer bursts for war are meet. But sweet lips murmuring under wreaths o'erarching, find the low whispers like their own most sweet. Steal, my lulled music, steal, like woman's half-heard tone, so that whoe'er shall hear shall think to feel in thee the voice of lips that love his own. At the end of that song, Ione's cheek blushed more deeply than before, and Glaucus had contrived, under cover of the table, to steal her hand. "It is a pretty song," said Fulvius, patronizingly. "Ah, if you would oblige us," murmured the wife of Pansa. "Do you wish Fulvius to sing?" asked the king of the feast, who had just called on the assembly to drink the health of the Roman senator, a cup to each letter of his name. "Can you ask?" said the matron, with a complimentary glance at the poet. Sallust snapped his fingers, and whispering the slave who came to learn his orders, the latter disappeared and returned in a few moments with a small harp in one hand and a branch of myrtle in the other. The slave approached the poet, and with a low reverence presented to him the harp. "Alas, I cannot play," said the poet. "Then you must sing to the myrtle. It is a Greek fashion. Diomed loves the Greeks. I love the Greeks. You love the Greeks. We all love the Greeks. And between you and me, this is not the only thing we have stolen from them. However, I introduced this custom, I, the king. Sing, subject, sing." The poet, with a bashful smile, took the myrtle in his hands, and after a short prelude, sang as follows, in a pleasant and well-tuned voice: THE CORONATION of the LOVES. The merry loves, one holiday, were all at gambols madly, but loves too long can seldom play without behaving sadly. They laughed, they toyed, they romped about, and then for change they all fell out. Fie, fie, how can they quarrel so? My Lesbia, ah, for shame, love, methinks 'tis scarce an hour ago, when we did just the same, love. The loves, 'tis thought, were free till then, they had no king or laws, dear, but gods like men should subject be, say all the ancient saws, dear. And so our crew resolved for quiet to choose a king to curb their riot. A kiss, ah, what a grievous thing, for both methinks 'twould be, child, if I should take some prudish king, and cease to be so free, child. Among their toys a casque they found, it was the helm of Ares, with horrent plumes the crest was crowned, it frightened all the Lares. So fine a king was never known, they placed the helmet on the throne. My girl, since valor wins the world, they chose a mighty master, but thy sweet flag of smiles unfurled would win the world much faster. The casque soon found the loves too wild, a troop for him to school them, for warriors know how one such child has aye contrived to fool them. They plagued him so, that in despair he took a wife the plague to share. If kings themselves thus find the strife of earth unshared, severe girl, why just to halve the ills of life, come take your partner here, girl. Within that room the bird of love the whole affair had eyed then, the monarch hailed the royal dove, and placed her by his side then. What mirth amidst the loves was seen, long live, they cried, our king and queen. Ah, Lesbia, would that thrones were mine, and crowns to deck that brow, love, and yet I know that heart of thine, for me is thrown enow, love. The urchins hoped to tease the mate, as they had teased the hero, but when the dove in judgment sate, they found her worse than Nero. Each look a frown, each word a law, the little subjects shook with awe. In thee I find the same deceit, too late, alas, a learner, for where a mien more gently sweet, and where a tyrant sterner. This song, which greatly suited the gay and lively fancy of the Pompeians, was received with considerable applause, and the widow insisted on crowning her namesake with the very branch of myrtle to which he had sung. It was easily twisted into a garland, and the immortal Fulvius was crowned amidst the clapping of hands and shouts of "Io, triumph!" The song and the harp now circulated round the party, a new myrtle branch being handed about, stopping at each person who could be prevailed upon to sing. The sun began now to decline, though the revellers, who had worn away several hours, perceived it not in their darkened chamber, and the senator, who was tired, and the warrior, who had to return to Herculaneum, rising to depart, gave the signal for the general dispersion. "Tarry yet a moment, my friends," said Diomed. "If you will go so soon, you must at least take a share in our concluding game." So saying, he motioned to one of the ministry, and whispering him, the slave went out, and presently returned with a small bowl containing various tablets carefully sealed, and apparently exactly similar. Each guest was to purchase one of these at the nominal price of the lowest piece of silver, and the sport of this lottery, which was the favorite diversion of Augustus, who introduced it, consisted in the inequality and sometimes the incongruity of the prizes, the nature and amount of which were specified within the tablets. For instance, the poet, with a wry face, drew one of his own poems. No physician ever less willingly swallowed his own draught. The warrior drew a case of bodkins, which gave rise to certain novel witticisms relative to Hercules and the distaff. The widow Fulvia obtained a large drinking cup, Julia a gentleman's buckle, and Lepidus a lady's patchbox. The most appropriate lot was drawn by the gambler Clodius, who reddened with anger on being presented to a set of cogged dice. A certain damp was thrown upon the gaiety which these various lots created by an accident that was considered ominous. Glaucus drew the most valuable of all the prizes, a small marble statue of Fortune, of Grecian workmanship. On handing it to him, the slaves suffered it to drop, and it broke in pieces. A shiver went round the assembly, and each voice cried spontaneously on the gods to avert the omen. Glaucus alone, though perhaps as superstitious as the rest, affected to be unmoved. "Sweet Neapolitan," whispered he tenderly to Ione, who had turned pale as the broken marble itself, "I accept the omen. It signifies that in obtaining thee, Fortune can give no more. She breaks her image when she blesses me with thine." In order to divert the impression which this incident had occasioned in an assembly which, considering the civilization of the guests, would seem miraculously superstitious, if at the present day in a country party we did not often see a lady grow hypochondriacal on leaving a room last of 13, Sallust, now crowning his cup with flowers, gave the health of their host. This was followed by a similar compliment to the emperor, and then with a parting cup to Mercury to send them pleasant slumbers, they concluded the entertainment by a last libation and broke up the party. Carriages and litters were little used in Pompeii, partly owing to the extreme narrowness of the streets, partly to the convenient smallness of the city. Most of the guests replacing their sandals, which they had put off in the banquet room, and enduing their cloaks, left the house on foot, attended by their slaves. Meanwhile, having seen Ione depart, Glaucus, turning to the staircase which led down to the rooms of Julia, was conducted by a slave to an apartment in which he found the merchant's daughter already seated. "Glaucus," said she, looking down, "I see that you really love Ione. She is indeed beautiful." "Julia is charming enough to be generous," replied the Greek. "Yes, I love Ione. Amidst all the youth who court you, may you have one worshipper as sincere." "I pray the gods to grant it. See, Glaucus, these pearls are the present I destined to your bride. May Juno give her health to wear them." So saying, she placed a case in his hand, containing a row of pearls of some size and price. It was so much the custom for persons about to be married to receive these gifts, that Glaucus could have little scruple in accepting the necklace, though the gallant and proud Athenian inly resolved to requite the gift by one of thrice its value. Julia, then stopping short his thanks, poured forth some wine into a small bowl. "You have drunk many toasts with my father," said she, smiling. "One now with me. Health and fortune to your bride." She touched the cup with her lips, and then presented it to Glaucus. The customary etiquette required that Glaucus should drain the whole contents. He accordingly did so. Julia, unknowing the deceit which Nydia had practised upon her, watched him with sparkling eyes. Although the witch had told her that the effect might not be immediate, she yet sanguinely trusted to an expeditious operation in favor of her charms. She was disappointed when she found Glaucus coldly replace the cup and converse with her in the same unmoved but gentle tone as before. And though she detained him as long as she decorously could do, no change took place in his manner. But tomorrow, thought she, exultingly recovering her disappointment, tomorrow, alas for Glaucus. Alas for him, indeed. End of chapter 3.
Book 4, Chapter 4 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 4. The story halts for a moment at an episode. Restless and anxious, Apicides consumed the day in wandering through the most sequestered walks in the vicinity of the city. The sun was slowly setting as he paused beside a lonely part of the Sanus, ere yet it wound amidst the evidences of luxury and power. Only through openings in the woods and vines were caught glimpses of the white and gleaming city, in which was heard in the distance no din, no sound, nor busiest hum of men. Amidst the green banks crept the lizard and the grasshopper, and here and there in the brake some solitary bird burst into sudden song, as suddenly stifled. There was deep calm around, but not the calm of night. The air still breathed of the freshness and life of day. The grass still moved to the stir of the insect horde, and on the opposite bank the graceful and white Capella passed browsing through the herbage, and paused at the wave to drink. As Apicides stood musingly gazing upon the waters, he heard beside him the low bark of a dog. "Be still, poor friend," said a voice at hand. "The stranger's step harms not thy master." The convert recognized the voice, and turning, he beheld the old mysterious man whom he had seen in the congregation of the Nazarenes. The old man was sitting upon a fragment of stone covered with ancient mosses. Beside him were his staff and scrip. At his feet lay a small shaggy dog, the companion in how many a pilgrimage perilous and strange. The face of the old man was as balm to the excited spirit of the neophyte. He approached, and craving his blessing, sat down beside him. "Thou art provided us for a journey, father," said he. "Wilt thou leave us yet?" "My son," replied the old man, "the days in store for me on earth are few and scanty. I employ them as becomes me, travelling from place to place, comforting those whom God has gathered together in his name, and proclaiming the glory of his Son, as testified to his servant. Thou hast looked, they tell me, on the face of Christ, and the face revived me from the dead. Know, young proselyte to the true faith, that I am he of whom thou readest in the scroll of the Apostle. In the far Judea, and in the city of Nain, there dwelt a widow, humble of spirit and sad of heart. For of all the ties of life, one son alone was spared to her. And she loved him with a melancholy love, for he was the likeness of the lost. And the son died. The reed on which she leaned was broken, the oil was dried up in the widow's cruse. They bore the dead upon his bier, and near the gate of the city, where the crowd were gathered, there came a silence over the sounds of woe, for the Son of God was passing by. The mother who followed the bier wept, not noisily, but all who looked upon her saw that her heart was crushed. And the Lord pitied her, and he touched the bier, and said, I say unto thee, arise. And the dead man woke, and looked upon the face of the Lord. Oh, that calm and solemn brow, that unutterable smile, that careworn and sorrowful face, lighted up with a God's benignity! It chased away the shadows of the grave. I rose, I spoke, I was living and in my mother's arms. Yes, I am the dead revived. The people shouted, the funeral horns rung forth merrily. There was a cry, God hath visited his people. I heard them not. I felt, I saw nothing but the face of the Redeemer. The old man paused, deeply moved, and the youth felt his blood creep and his hair stir. He was in the presence of one who had known the mystery of death. Till that time, renewed the widow's son, I had been as other men, thoughtless, not abandoned, taking no heed but of the things of love and life. Nay, I had inclined to the gloomy faith of the earthly Sadducee. But raised from the dead, from awful and desert dreams that these lips never dare reveal, recalled upon earth to testify the powers of heaven, once more mortal, the witness of immortality, I drew a new being from the grave. O faded, O lost Jerusalem, him from whom came my life, I beheld adjudged to the agonized and parching death. Far in the mighty crowd I saw the light rest and glimmer over the cross. I heard the hooting mob. I cried aloud. I raved, I threatened. None heeded me. I was lost in the whirl and the roar of thousands. But even then, in my agony and his own, methought the glazing eye of the Son of Man sought me out. His lips smiled as when it conquered death. It hushed me, and I became calm. He who had defied the grave for another, what was the grave to him? The sun shone aslant the pale and powerful features, and then died away. Darkness fell over the earth. How long it endured, I know not. A loud cry came through the gloom, a sharp and bitter cry, and all was silent. But who shall tell the terrors of the night? I walked along the city, the earth reeled to and fro, and the houses trembled to their base. The living had deserted the streets, but not the dead. Through the gloom I saw them glide, the dim and ghastly shapes in the cerements of the grave, with horror and woe and warning on their unmoving lips and lightless eyes. They swept by me as I passed. They glared upon me. I had been their brother, and they bowed their heads in recognition. They had risen to tell the living that the dead can rise. Again the old man paused, and when he resumed it was in a calmer tone. From that night I resigned all earthly thought but that of serving him. A preacher and a pilgrim, I have traversed the remotest corners of the earth, proclaiming his divinity and bringing new converts to his fold. I come as the wind, and as the wind depart, sowing as the wind sows the seeds that enrich the world. Son, on earth we shall meet no more. Forget not this hour. What are the pleasures and the pomps of life? As the lamp shines, so life glitters for an hour. But the soul's light is the star that burns for ever in the heart of inimitable space. It was then that their conversation fell upon the general and sublime doctrines of immortality. It soothed and elevated the young mind of the convert, which yet clung to many of the damps and shadows of that cell of faith which he had so lately left. It was the air of heaven breathing on the prisoner released at last. There was a strong and marked distinction between the Christianity of the old man and that of Olynthus. That of the first was more soft, more gentle, more divine. The heroism of Olynthus had something in it fierce and intolerant. It was necessary to the part he was destined to play. It had in it more of the courage of the martyr than the charity of the saint. It aroused, it excited, it nerved, rather than subdued and softened. But the whole heart of that divine old man was bathed in love. The smile of the deity had burned away from it the leaven of earthlier and coarser passions, and left to the energy of the hero all the meekness of the child. "And now," said he, rising at length as the sun's last ray died in the west, "now, in the cool of twilight, I pursue my way towards the imperial Rome. There yet dwell some holy men who, like me, have beheld the face of Christ, and them would I see before I die. But the night is chill for thine age, my father, and the way is long, and the robber haunts it. Rest thee till tomorrow." "Kind son, what is there in this script to tempt the robber? and the night and the solitude, these make the ladder round which angels cluster, and beneath which my spirit can dream of God. Oh, none can know what the pilgrim feels as he walks on his holy course, nursing no fear and dreading no danger. For God is with him. He hears the winds murmur glad tidings. The woods sleep in the shadow of almighty wings. The stars are the scriptures of heaven, the tokens of love, and the witnesses of immortality. Night is the pilgrim's day. With these words the old man pressed Apicides to his breast, and taking up his staff and scrip, the dog bounded cheerily before him, and with slow steps and downcast eyes he went his way. The convert stood watching his bended form till the trees shut the last glimpse from his view, and then, as the stars broke forth, he woke from the musings with a start, reminded of his appointment with Olynthus. End of Book 4, Chapter 4. Book 4, Chapter 5 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 5. The Philtre, Its Effect. When Glaucus arrived at his own home, he found Nydia seated under the portico of his garden. In fact, she had sought his house in the mere chance that he might return at an early hour. Anxious, fearful, anticipative, she resolved upon seizing the earliest opportunity of availing herself of the love-charm, while at the same time she half hoped the opportunity might be deferred. It was then in that fearful, burning mood, her heart beating, her cheek flushing, that Nydia awaited the possibility of Glaucus's return before the night. He crossed the portico just as the first stars began to rise, and the heaven above had assumed its most purple robe. "Oh, my child, wait you for me?" "Nay, I have been tending the flowers, and did but linger a little while to rest myself." "It has been warm," said Glaucus, placing himself also on one of the seats beneath the colonnade. "Very." "Wilt thou summon Davus? The wine I have drunk heats me, and I long for some cooling drink." Here at once, suddenly and unexpectedly, the very opportunity that Nydia awaited presented itself. Of himself, at his own free choice, he afforded to her that occasion. She breathed quick. "I will prepare for you myself," said she, "the summer draught that Ione loves, of honey and weak wine cooled in snow." "Thanks," said the unconscious Glaucus. "If I only love it enough, it would be grateful were it poison." Nydia frowned and then smiled. She withdrew for a few moments, and returned with the cup containing the beverage. Glaucus took it from her hand. What would not Nydia have given then for 1 hour's prerogative of sight, to have watched her hopes ripening to effect, to have seen the first dawn of the imagined love, to have worshipped with more than Persian adoration the rising of that sun which her credulous soul believed was to break upon her dreary night. Far different, as she stood then and there, were the thoughts, the emotions of the blind girl from those of the vain Pompeian under a similar suspense. In the last, what poor and frivolous passions had made up the daring whole? What petty pique, what small revenge, what expectation of a paltry triumph had swelled the attributes of that sentiment she dignified with the name of love. But in the wild heart of the Thessalian all was pure, uncontrolled, unmodified passion, erring, unwomanly, frenzied, but debased by no elements of a more sordid feeling. Filled with love as with life itself, how could she resist the occasion of winning love in return? She leaned for support against the wall, and her face, before so flushed, was now white as snow, and with her delicate hands clasped convulsively together, her lips apart, her eyes on the ground, she waited the next words Glaucus should utter. Glaucus had raised the cup to his lips. He had already drained about a fourth of its contents, when his eye suddenly glancing upon the face of Nydia, he was so forcibly struck by its alteration, by its intense and painful and strange expression, that he paused abruptly, and still holding the cup near his lips, exclaimed, "Why, Nydia, Nydia, I say, art thou ill or in pain? Nay, thy face speaks for thee. What ails my poor child?" As he spoke, he put down the cup, and rose from his seat to approach her, when a sudden pang shot coldly to his heart, and was followed by a wild, confused, dizzy sensation at the brain. The floor seemed to glide from under him. His feet seemed to move on air. A mighty and unearthly gladness rushed upon his spirit. He felt too buoyant for the earth. He longed for wings. Nay, it seemed in the buoyancy of his new existence as if he possessed them. He burst involuntarily into a loud and thrilling laugh. He clapped his hands. He bounded aloft. He was as a pythoness inspired. Suddenly as it came, this preternatural transport passed, though only partially, away. He now felt his blood rushing loudly and rapidly through his veins. It seemed to swell, to exult, to leap along, as a stream that has burst its bounds and hurries to the ocean. It throbbed in his ear with a mighty sound. He felt it mount to his brow. He felt the veins in his temples stretch and swell, as if they could no longer contain the violent and increasing tide. Then a kind of darkness fell over his eyes. Darkness, but not entire, for through the dim shade he saw the opposite walls glow out, and the figures painted thereon seemed ghost-like, to creep and glide. What was most strange, he did not feel himself ill. He did not sink or quail beneath the dread frenzy that was gathering over him. The novelty of the feeling seemed bright and vivid. He felt as if a younger health had been infused into his frame. He was gliding on to madness, and he knew it not. Nydia had not answered his first question. She had not been able to reply. His wild and fearful laugh had roused her from her passionate suspense. She could not see his fierce gesture. She could not mark his reeling and unsteady step as he paced unconsciously to and fro, but she heard the words, broken, incoherent, insane, that gushed from his lips. She became terrified and appalled. She hastened to him, feeling with her arms until she touched his knees, and then, falling on the ground, she embraced them, weeping with terror and excitement. "Oh, speak to me, speak! You do not hate me! Speak, speak!" "By the bright goddess, a beautiful land, this Cyprus! Oh, how they fill us with wine instead of blood! Now they open the veins of the fawn yonder, to show how the tide within bubbles and sparkles. Come hither, jolly old god! Thou ridest on a goat, eh? What long silky hair he has! He is worth all the coursers of Parthia. But a word with thee, this wine of thine is too strong for us mortals. Oh, beautiful! The boughs are at rest. The green waves of the forest have caught the zephyr and drowned him. Not a breath stirs the leaves, and I view the dreams sleeping with folded wings upon the motionless elm. And I look beyond, and I see a blue stream sparkle in the silent noon. A fountain springing aloft. Ah, my fount, thou wilt not put out rays of my Grecian sun, though thou triest ever so hard with thy nimble and silver arms. And now, what form steals yonder through the boughs? She glides like a moonbeam. She has a garland of oak leaves on her head. In her hand is a vase upturned, from which she pours pink and tiny shells and sparkling water. Oh, look on yon face! Man never before saw its like. See, we are alone, only I and she in the wide forest. There is no smile upon her lips. She moves, grave and sweetly sad. Fly, it is a nymph. It is one of the wild Pompeii. Whoever sees her becomes mad. Fly. See, she discovers me. Oh, Glaucus, Glaucus, do you not know me? Rave not so wildly, or thou wilt kill me with a word. A new change seemed now to operate upon the jarring and disordered mind of the unfortunate Athenian. He put his hand upon Nydia's silken hair. He smoothed the locks. He looked wistfully upon her face, and then, as in the broken chain of thought one or two links were yet unsevered, it seemed that her countenance brought its associations of Ione, and with that remembrance his madness became yet more powerful, and it swayed and tinged by passion as he burst forth, "I swear by Venus, by Diana, and by Juno, that though I have now the world on my shoulders, as my countryman Hercules— ah, dull Rome, whoever was truly great was of Greece. Why, you would be godless if it were not for us. I say, as my countryman Hercules had before me, I would let it fall into chaos for one smile from Ione. Oh, beautiful, adored," he added, in a voice inexpressibly fond and plaintive, "thou lovest me not. Thou art unkind to me. The Egyptian hath belied me to thee. Thou knowest not what hours I have spent beneath thy casement. Thou knowest not how I have outwatched the stars, thinking thou, my sun, wouldst rise at last. And thou lovest me not, thou forsakest me. Oh, do not leave me now. I feel that my life will not be long. Let me gaze on thee at least until the last. I am of the bright land of thy fathers. I have trod the heights of Phyle. I have gathered the hyacinth and rose amidst the olive groves of Ilyssus. Thou shouldst not desert me, for thy fathers were brothers to my own. And they say this land is lovely, and these climes serene. But I will bear thee with me. Oh, dark form, why risest thou like a cloud between me and mine? Death sits calmly dread upon thy brow. On thy lip is the smile that slays. Thy name is Orcus, but on earth men call thee Arbaces. See, I know thee. Fly, dim shadow, thy spells avail not." "Glaucus, Glaucus," murmured Nydia, releasing her hold and falling, beneath the excitement of her dismay, remorse, and anguish, insensible on the floor. "Who calls?" said he in a loud voice. "Ione! It is she! They have borne her off! We will save her! Where is my stylus? Ah, I have it! I come, Ione, to thy rescue! I come! I come!" So saying, the Athenian with one bound passed the portico, he traversed the house, and rushed with swift but vacillating steps, and muttering audibly to himself, down the starlit streets. The direful potion burnt like fire in his veins, for its effect was made perhaps still more sudden from the wine he had drunk previously. Used to the excesses of nocturnal revellers, the citizens, with smiles and winks, gave way to his reeling steps. They naturally imagined him under the influence of the Bromian god, not vainly worshipped at Pompeii. But they who looked twice upon his face started in a nameless fear, and the smile withered from their lips. He passed the more populous streets, and pursuing mechanically the way to Ione's house, he traversed a more deserted quarter, and entered now the lonely grove of Cybele, in which Apicides had held his interview with Olynthus. End of Book 4, Chapter 5.
Book 4, Chapter 6 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 6. A reunion of different actors. Streams that flowed apparently apart rush into one gulf. Impatient to learn whether the fell drug had yet been administered by Julia to his hated rival, and with what effect, Arbaces resolved, as the evening came on, to seek her house and satisfy his suspense. It was customary, as I have before said, for men at that time to carry abroad with them the tablets and the stylus attached to their girdle, and with the girdle they were put off when at home. In fact, under the appearance of a literary instrument, the Romans carried about with them in that same stylus a very sharp and formidable weapon. It was with his stylus that Cassius stabbed Caesar in the Senate house. Taking, then, his girdle and his cloak, Arbaces left his house, supporting his steps, which were still somewhat feeble, though hope and vengeance had conspired greatly with his own medical science, which was profound, to restore his natural strength. By his long staff, Arbaces took his way to the villa of Diomed. And beautiful is the moonlight of the south. In those climes the night so quickly glides into the day, that twilight scarcely makes a bridge between them. One moment of darker purple in the sky, of 1,000 rose hues in the water, of shade half victorious over light, and then burst forth at once the countless stars. The moon is up, night has resumed her reign. Brightly then, and softly bright, fell the moonbeams over the antique grove consecrated to Cybele. The stately trees, whose date went beyond tradition, cast their long shadows over the soil, while through the openings in their boughs the stars shone, still and frequent. The whiteness of the small sacellum in the center of the grove, amidst the dark foliage, had in it something abrupt and startling. It recalled at once the purpose to which the wood was consecrated, its holiness and solemnity. With a swift and stealthy pace, Calenus, gliding under the shade of the trees, reached the chapel, and gently putting back the boughs that completely closed around its rear, settled himself in its concealment. A concealment so complete, that with the fane in front and the trees behind, that no unsuspicious passenger could possibly have detected him. Again, all was apparently solitary in the grove. Afar off you heard faintly the voices of some noisy revellers, or the music that played cheerily to the groups that then, as now in those climates, during the nights of summer, lingered in the streets, and enjoyed in the fresh air and the liquid moonlight a milder day. From the height on which the grove was placed, you saw through the intervals of the trees the broad and purple sea, rippling in the distance, the white villas of Stabiae in the curving shore, and the dim Lectiarian hills mingling with the delicious sky. Presently the tall figure of Arbaces, in his way to the house of Diomed, entered the extreme end of the grove, and at the same instant Apicides, also bound to his appointment with Olynthus, crossed the Egyptian's path. Apicides, said Arbaces, recognizing the priest at a glance. When last we met you were my foe. I have wished since then to see you, for I would have you still my pupil and my friend. Apicides started at the voice of the Egyptian, and halting abruptly, gazed upon him with a countenance full of contending, bitter, and scornful emotions. Villain and impostor, said he at length, thou hast recovered then from the jaws of the grave. But think not again to weave around me thy guilty meshes. Retiarius, I am armed against thee. Hush, said Arbaces in a very low voice, but his pride, which in that descent of kings was great, betrayed the wound it received from the insulting epithets of the priest in the quiver of his lip and the flush of his tawny brow. Hush, more low, thou mayest be overheard, and if other ears than mine had drunk those sounds, why— Dost thou threaten? What if the whole city had heard me? The manes of my ancestors could not have suffered me to forgive thee. But behold and hear me. Thou art enraged that I would have offered violence to thy sister. Nay, peace, peace, but one instant I pray thee. Thou art right, it was the frenzy of passion and of jealousy. I have repented bitterly of my madness. Forgive me, I, who never implored pardon of living man, beseech thee now to forgive me. Nay, I will atone the insult. I ask thy sister in marriage. Start not. Consider. What is the alliance of yon holiday Greek compared to mine? Wealth unbounded, birth that in its far antiquity leaves your Greek and Roman names the things of yesterday. Science. But that thou knowest. Give me thy sister, and my whole life shall atone a moment's error. Egyptian, were even I to consent, my sister loathes the very air thou breathest. But I have my own wrongs to forgive. I may pardon thee that thou hast made me a tool to thy deceits, but never that thou hast seduced me to become the abettor of thy vices. A polluted and a perjured man. Tremble. Even now I prepare the hour in which thou and thy false gods shall be unveiled. Thy lewd and Circean life shall be dragged to day, thy mumming oracles disclosed. The fane of the idol Isis shall be a byword and a scorn, the name of Arbaces a mark for the hisses of execration. Tremble. The flush on the Egyptian's brow was succeeded by a livid paleness. He looked behind, before, around, to feel assured that none were by, and then he fixed his dark and dilating eye on the priest, with such a gaze of wrath and menace, that one, perhaps, less supported than Apicides by a fervent daring of a divine zeal, could not have faced with unflinching look that lowering aspect. As it was, however, the young convert met it unmoved, and returned it with an eye of proud defiance. Apicides, said the Egyptian in a tremulous and inward tone, beware. What is it thou wouldst meditate? Speakest thou? Reflect, pause before thou repliest. From the hasty influences of wrath, as yet divining no unsettled purpose, or from some fixed design? I speak from the inspiration of the true God, whose servant I now am, answered the Christian boldly, and in the knowledge that by his grace human courage has already fixed the date of thy hypocrisy and thy demon's worship. Ere thrice the sun has dawned, thou wilt know all. Dark sorcerer, tremble, and farewell. All the fierce and lurid passions which he inherited from his nation and his clime, at all times but ill concealed beneath the blandness of craft and the coldness of philosophy, were released in the breast of the Egyptian. Rapidly one thought chased another. He saw before him an absolute barrier to even a lawful alliance with Ione, the fellow champion of Glaucus in the struggle which had baffled his designs, the reviler of his name, the threatened desecrator of the goddess he served while he disbelieved, the avowed and approaching revealer of his own impostures and vices. His love, his repute, nay, his very life might be in danger. The day and hour seemed even to have been fixed for some design against him. He knew by the words of the convert that Apicides had adopted the Christian faith. He knew the indomitable zeal which led on the proselytes of that creed. Such was his enemy. He grasped his stylus. That enemy was in his power. They were now before the chapel. One hasty glance once more he cast around. He saw none near. Silence and solitude alike tempted him. "Die, then, in thy rashness," he muttered. "Away, obstacle to my rushing fates!" And just as the young Christian had turned to depart, Arbaces raised his hand high over the left shoulder of Apicides, and plunged his sharp weapon twice into his breast. Apicides fell to the ground pierced to the heart. He fell mute, without even a groan, at the very base of the sacred chapel. Arbaces gazed upon him for a moment with a fierce animal joy of conquest over a foe. But presently the full sense of the danger to which he was exposed flashed upon him. He wiped his weapon carefully in the long grass, and with the very garments of his victim, drew his cloak around him, and was about to depart, when he saw, coming up the path right before him, the figure of a young man, whose steps reeled and vacillated strangely as he advanced. The quiet moonlight streamed full upon his face, which seemed, by the whitening ray, colorless as marble. The Egyptian recognized the face and form of Glaucus. The unfortunate and benighted Greek was chanting a disconnected and mad song, composed from snatches of hymns and sacred odes, all jarringly woven together. "Ha!" thought the Egyptian, instantaneously divining his state and its terrible cause. "So, then, the hell draught works, and destiny hath sent thee hither to crush two of my foes at once." Quickly, even ere this thought occurred to him, he had withdrawn on one side of the chapel, and concealed himself amongst the boughs. From that lurking place he watched, as a tiger in his lair, the advance of his second victim. He noted the wandering and restless fire in the bright and beautiful eyes of the Athenian, the convulsions that distorted his statue-like features, and writhed his hueless lip. He saw that the Greek was utterly deprived of reason. Nevertheless, as Glaucus came up to the dead body of Apicides, from which the dark red stream flowed slowly over the grass, so strange and ghastly a spectacle could not fail to arrest him, benighted and erring as was his glimmering sense. He paused, placed his hand to his brow, as if to collect himself, and then saying, "What ho! Endymion, sleepest thou so soundly? What has the moon said to thee? Thou makest me jealous. It is time to wake." He stooped down with the intention of lifting up the body. Forgetting, feeling not, his own debility, the Egyptian sprung from his hiding place, and, as the Greek bent, struck him forcibly to the ground, over the very body of the Christian. Then, raising his powerful voice to its highest pitch, he shouted, "Ho, citizens! Oh, help me! Run hither! Hither! A murder! A murder before your very fane! Help, or the murderer escapes!" As he spoke, he placed his foot on the breast of Glaucus, an idle and superfluous precaution; for the potion operating with the fall, the Greek lay there motionless and insensible, save that now and then his lips gave vent to some vague and raving sounds. As he there stood awaiting the coming of those his voice still continued to summons, perhaps some remorse, some compunctious visitings, for despite his crimes he was human, haunted the breast of the Egyptian. The defenseless state of Glaucus, his wandering words, his shattered reason, smote him even more than the death of Apicides, and he said half audibly to himself, "Poor clay, poor human reason, where is the soul now? I could spare thee, O my rival, rival nevermore. But destiny must be obeyed. My safety demands thy sacrifice." With that, as if to drown compunction, he shouted yet more loudly, and drawing from the girdle of Glaucus the stylus it contained, he steeped it in the blood of the murdered man, and laid it beside the corpse. And now, fast and breathless, several of the citizens came thronging to the place, some with torches, which the moon rendered unnecessary, but which flared red and tremulously against the darkness of the trees. They surrounded the spot. "Lift up yon corpse," said the Egyptian, "and guard well the murderer." They raised the body, and great was their horror and scared indignation to discover in that lifeless clay a priest of the adored and venerable Isis. But still greater, perhaps, was their surprise when they found the accused in the brilliant and admired Athenian. "Glaucus!" cried the bystanders with one accord. "Is it even credible?" "I would sooner," whispered one man to his neighbor, "believe it to be the Egyptian himself." Here a centurion thrust himself into the gathering crowd with an air of authority. "How? Blood spilt! Who the murderer?" The bystanders pointed to Glaucus. "He? By Mars, he has rather the air of being the victim. Who accuses him?" "I," said Arbaces, drawing himself up haughtily, and the jewels which adorned his dress flashing in the eyes of the soldier instantly convinced that worthy warrior of the witness's respectability. "Pardon me, your name?" said he. "Arbaces. It is well known, methinks, in Pompeii." Passing through the grove, I beheld before me the Greek and the priest in earnest conversation. I was struck by the reeling motions of the first, his violent gestures, and the loudness of his voice. He seemed to me either drunk or mad. Suddenly I saw him raise his stylus. I darted forward, too late to arrest the blow. He had twice stabbed his victim, and was bending over him, when, in my horror and indignation, I struck the murderer to the ground. He fell without a struggle, which makes me yet more suspect that he was not altogether in his senses when the crime was perpetrated. For, recently recovered from a severe illness, my blow was comparatively feeble, and the frame of Glaucus, as you see, is strong and youthful." "His eyes are open now, his lips move," said the soldier. "Speak, prisoner, what sayest thou to the charge?" "The charge! Ha, ha! Why, it was merrily done. When the old hag set her serpent at me, and Hecate stood by laughing from ear to ear, what could I do? But I am ill, I faint, the serpent's fiery tongue hath bitten me. Bear me to bed, and send for your physician. Old Aesculapius himself will attend me if you let him know that I am Greek. Oh, mercy, mercy! I burn! Marrow in brain, I burn!" And with a thrilling and fierce groan, the Athenian fell back in the arms of the bystanders. "He raves," said the officer compassionately, "and in his delirium he has struck the priest. Hath anyone present seen him today?" "I," said one of the spectators, "beheld him in the morning. He passed my shop and accosted me. He seemed well and sane as the stoutest of us." "And I saw him half an hour ago," said another, "passing up the streets, muttering to himself with strange gestures, and just as the Egyptian has described." "A corroboration of the witnesses. It must be too true. He must at all events to the praetor. A pity, so young and so rich. But the crime is dreadful. A priest of Isis, in his very robes, too, and at the base itself of our most ancient chapel." At these words the crowd were reminded more forcibly, than in their excitement and curiosity they had yet been, of the heinousness of the sacrilege. They shuddered in pious horror. "No wonder the earth has quaked," said one, "when it held such a monster." "Away with him to prison! Away!" cried they all. And one solitary voice was heard shrilly and joyously above the rest, "The beasts will not want a gladiator now! Ho, ho, for the merry, merry show!" It was the voice of the young woman whose conversation with Medon has been repeated. "True, true, it chances in season for the games," cried several, and at that thought all pity for the accused seemed vanished. His youth, his beauty, but fitted him better for the purpose of the arena. "Bring hither some planks, or, if at hand, a litter, to bear the dead," said Arbaces. "A priest of Isis ought scarcely to be carried to his temple by vulgar hands like a butchered gladiator." At this the bystanders reverently laid the corpse of Apicides on the ground, with the face upwards. and some of them went in search of some contrivance to bear the body, untouched by the profane. It was just at that time that the crowd gave way to right and left as a sturdy form forced itself through, and Olynthus the Christian stood immediately confronting the Egyptian. But his eyes, at first, only rested with inexpressible grief and horror on that gory side and upturned face, on which the agony of violent death yet lingered. "Murdered!" he said. "Is it thy zeal that has brought thee to this? Have they detected thy noble purpose, and by death prevented their own shame?" He turned his head abruptly, and his eyes fell full on the solemn features of the Egyptian. As he looked, you might see in his face, and even in the slight shiver of his frame, the repugnance and aversion which the Christian felt for one whom he knew to be so dangerous and so criminal. It was indeed the gaze of the bird upon the basilisk, so silent was it and so prolonged. But shaking off the sudden chill that had crept over him, Olynthus extended his right arm towards Arbaces and said, in a deep and loud voice, "Murder hath been done upon this corpse. Where is the murderer? Stand forth, Egyptian, for, as the Lord liveth, I believe thou art the man." An anxious and perturbed change might for one moment be detected on the dusky features of Arbaces, but it gave way to the frowning expression of indignation and scorn, as, awed and arrested by the suddenness and vehemence of the charge, the spectators pressed nearer and nearer upon the two more prominent actors. "I know," said Arbaces proudly, "who is my accuser, and I guess wherefore he thus arraigns me. Men and citizens, I know this man for the most bitter of the Nazarenes, if that or Christians be their proper name. What marvel that in his malignity he dares to accuse even an Egyptian of the murder of a priest of Egypt?" "I know him, I know the dog," shouted several voices. "It is Olynthus the Christian, or rather the atheist. He denies the gods." "Peace, brethren," said Olynthus with dignity, "and hear me. This murdered priest of Isis before his death embraced the Christian faith. He revealed to me the dark sins, the sorceries of yon Egyptian, the mummeries and delusions of the fane of Isis. He was about to declare them publicly. He, a stranger, unoffending, without enemies. Who should shed his blood but one of those who feared his witness? Who might fear that testimony the most? Arbaces the Egyptian." "You hear him," said Arbaces. "You hear him. He blasphemes. Ask him if he believes in Isis." "Do I believe in an evil demon?" returned Olynthus boldly. A groan and shudder passed through the assembly. Nothing daunted, for prepared at every time for peril, and in the present excitement losing all prudence, the Christian continued, "Back, idolaters! This clay is not for your vain and polluting rites. It is to us, to the followers of Christ, that the last offices due to a Christian belong. I claim this dust in the name of the great Creator who has recalled the spirit." With so solemn and commanding a voice and aspect the Christian spoke these words, that even the crowd forbore to utter aloud the execration of fear and hatred which in their hearts they conceived. And never perhaps, since Lucifer and the Archangel contended for the body of the mighty lawgiver, was there a more striking subject for the painter's genius than that scene exhibited. The dark trees, the stately fane, the moon full on the corpse of the deceased, the torches tossing wildly to and fro in the rear, the various faces of the motley audience, the insensible form of the Athenian, supported in the distance and in the foreground, and above all, the forms of Arbaces and the Christian, the first drawn to its full height, far taller than the herd around, his arms folded, his brow knit, his eyes fixed, his lips slightly curled in defiance and disdain, the last bearing, on the brow worn and furrowed, the majesty of an equal command, the features stern yet frank, the aspect bold yet open, the quiet dignity of the whole form impressed with an ineffable earnestness, hushed as it were in a solemn sympathy with the awe he himself had created. His left hand pointing to the corpse, his right hand raised to heaven. The centurion pressed forward again. "In the first place, hast thou, Olynthus, or whatever be thy name, Any proof of the charge thou hast made against Arbaces, beyond thy vague suspicions?" Olynthus remained silent. The Egyptian laughed contemptuously. "Dost thou claim the body of a priest of Isis as one of the Nazarene or Christian sect?" "I do." "Swear then by yon fane, yon statue of Cybele, by yon most ancient Sacellum in Pompeii, that the dead man embraced your faith." "Vain man, I disown your idols. I abhor your temples. How can I swear by Cybele then?" "Away, away with the atheist! Away! The earth will swallow us if we suffer these blasphemers in a sacred grove. Away with him to death!" "To the beasts!" added a female voice in the center of the crowd. "We shall have a one apiece now for the lion and tiger." "If, O Nazarene, thou disbelievest in Cybele, which of our gods dost thou own?" resumed the soldier, unmoved by the cries around. "None." "Hark to him! Hark!" cried the crowd. "O vain and blind!" continued the Christian, raising his voice. "Can you believe in images of wood and stone? Do you imagine that they have eyes to see, or ears to hear, or hands to help ye? Is yon mute thing, carved by man's art, a goddess? Hath it made mankind? Alas, by mankind was it made. Lo, convince yourself of its nothingness, of your folly." And as he spoke he strode across to the fane, and ere any of the bystanders were aware of his purpose, he, in his compassion or his zeal, struck the statue of wood from its pedestal. "See!" cried he, "your goddess cannot avenge herself. Is this a thing to worship?" Further words were denied to him. So gross and daring a sacrilege, of one too of the most sacred of their places of worship, filled even the most lukewarm with rage and horror. With one accord the crowd rushed upon him, seized, and but for the interference of the centurion, they would have torn him to pieces. "Peace," said the soldier authoritatively. "Refer we this insolent blasphemer to the proper tribunal. Time has been already wasted. Bear we both the culprits to the magistrates. Place the body of the priest on the litter. Carry it to his own home." At this moment a priest of Isis stepped forward. "I claim these remains according to the custom of the priesthood." "The flamen be obeyed," said the centurion. "How is the murderer?" "Insensible or asleep." "Were his crimes less, I would pity him. On!" Arbaces, as he turned, met the eye of that priest of Isis. It was Calenus; and something there was in that glance, so significant and sinister, that the Egyptian muttered to himself, "Could he have witnessed the deed?" A girl darted from the crowd, and gazed hard on the face of Olynthus. "By Jupiter, a stout knave! I say, we shall have a man for the tiger now, one for each beast." "Ho!" shouted the mob. "A man for the lion and another for the tiger. What luck! Io Paean!" End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Book 4, Chapter 7, of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 7. In which the reader learns the condition of Glaucus. Friendship tested. Enmity softened. Love the same, because the one loving is blind. The night was somewhat advanced, and the gay lounging places of the Pompeians were still crowded. You might observe in the countenances of the various idlers a more earnest expression than usual. They talked in large knots and groups, as if they sought by numbers to divide the half painful, half pleasurable anxiety which belonged to the subject on which they conversed. It was a subject of life and death. A young man passed briskly by the graceful portico of the Temple of Fortune; so briskly, indeed, that he came with no slight force full against the rotund and comely form of that respectable citizen Diomed, who was retiring homeward to his suburban villa. "Holloa!" groaned the merchant, recovering with some difficulty his equilibrium. "Have you no eyes? or do you think I have no feeling? By Jupiter! You have well nigh driven out the divine particle. Another such shock, and my soul will be in Hades. Ah, Diomed, is it you? Forgive my inadvertence. I was absorbed in thinking of the reverses of life. Our poor friend Glaucus, eh? Who could have guessed it? Well, but tell me, Clodius, is he really to be tried by the Senate? Yes, they say the crime is of so extraordinary a nature that the Senate itself must adjudge it, and so the lictors are to induct him formally. Has he been accused publicly, then? To be sure. Where have you been not to hear that? Why, I have only just returned from Neapolis, whither I went on business the very morning after his crime. So shocking, and at my house the same night that it happened. There is no doubt of his guilt, said Clodius, shrugging his shoulders. And as these crimes take precedence of all little undignified peccadilloes, they will hasten to finish the sentence previous to the games. The games! Good gods! replied Diomed, with a slight shudder. Can they adjudge him to the beasts? So young, so rich! True, but then he is a Greek. Had he been a Roman, it would have been 1,000 pities. These foreigners can be borne with in their prosperity, but in adversity we must not forget that they are in reality slaves. However, we of the upper classes are always tender-hearted, and he would certainly get off tolerably well if he were left to us. For, between ourselves, what is a paltry priest of Isis? What Isis herself? But the common people are superstitious. They clamor for the blood of the sacrilegious one. It is dangerous not to give way to public opinion. And the blasphemer, the Christian, or Nazarene, or whatever else he be called? Oh, poor dog! If he will sacrifice to Cybele or Isis, he will be pardoned. If not, the tiger has him. At least, so I suppose. But the trial will decide. We talk while the urn's still empty. And the Greek may yet escape the deadly theta of his own alphabet. But enough of this gloomy subject. How is the fair Julia? Well, I fancy. Commend me to her. But hark! The door yonder creaks on its hinges. It is the house of the praetor. Who comes forth? By Pollux! It is the Egyptian. What can he want with our official friend? Some conference touching the murder, doubtless, replied Diomed. But what was supposed to be the inducement to the crime? Glaucus was to have married the priest's sister. Yes, some say Opposites refused the alliance. It might have been a sudden quarrel. Glaucus was evidently drunk, nay, so much so as to have been quite insensible when taken up, and I hear is still delirious. Whether with wine, terror, remorse, the Furies, or the Bacchanals, I cannot say. Poor fellow! He has good counsel? The best, Caius Pollio, an eloquent fellow enough. Pollio has been hiring all the poor gentlemen and well-born spendthrifts of Pompeii to dress shabbily and sneak about, swearing their friendship to Glaucus, who would not have spoken to them to be made emperor. I will do him justice, he was a gentleman in his choice acquaintance, and trying to melt the stony citizens into pity. But it will not do. Isis is mightily popular just at this moment. And, by the by, I have some merchandise at Alexandria. Yes, Isis ought to be protected. True. So farewell, old gentleman, we shall meet soon. If not, we must have a friendly bet at the amphitheatre. All my calculations are confounded by this cursed misfortune of Glaucus. He had bet on Lytton the gladiator. I must make up my tablets somewhere. Vale. Leaving the less active Diomed to regain his villa, Clodius strode on, humming a Greek air, and perfuming the night with the odorous that steamed from his snowy garments and flowing locks. If, thought he, Glaucus feed the lion, Julia will no longer have a person to love better than me. She will certainly dote on me, and so I suppose I must marry. By the gods, the 12 lines begin to fail. Men look suspiciously at my hand when it rattles the dice. That infernal Sallust insinuates cheating, and if it be discovered that the ivory is clogged, why farewell to the merry supper and the perfumed billet. Clodius is undone. Better marry, then, while I may, renounce gaming, and push my fortune, or rather the gentle Julia's, at the imperial court. Thus muttering the schemes of his ambition, if by that high name the projects of Clodius may be called, the gamester found himself suddenly accosted. He turned and beheld the dark brow of Arbaces. "Hail, noble Clodius! Pardon my interruption, and inform me, I pray you, which is the house of Sallust?" "It is but a few yards hence, wise Arbaces, but what does Sallust entertain tonight?" "I know not," answered the Egyptian, "nor am I, perhaps, one of those he would seek as a boon companion. But thou knowest that his house holds the person of Glaucus, the murderer." "Ay, he, good-hearted epicure, believes in the Greek's innocence. You remind me that he has become his surety, and therefore till the trial is responsible for his appearance. Well, Sallust's house is better than a prison, especially that wretched hole in the forum. But for what can you seek Glaucus?" "Why, noble Clodius, if we could save him from execution it would be well. The condemnation of the rich is a blow upon society itself. I should like to confer with him, for I hear he has recovered his senses, and ascertain the motives of his crime. They may be so extenuating as to plead in his defense." "You are benevolent, Arbaces." "Benevolence is the duty of one who aspires to wisdom," replied the Egyptian modestly. "Which way lies Sallust's mansion?" "I will show you," said Clodius, "if you will suffer me to accompany you a few steps. But, pray what has become of the poor girl who was to have wed the Athenian, the sister of the murdered priest?" "Alas, well nigh insane. Sometimes she utters imprecations on the murderer, then suddenly stops short, then cries, 'But why curse? O my brother, Glaucus was not thy murderer, never will I believe it.' Then she begins again, and again stops short, and mutters awfully to herself, 'Yet if it were indeed he?'" "Unfortunate Ione!" "But it is well for her that those solemn cares to the dead which religion enjoins have hitherto greatly absorbed her attention from Glaucus and herself, and, in the dimness of her senses, she scarcely seems aware that Glaucus is apprehended and on the eve of trial. When the funeral rites due to Apicides are performed, her apprehension will return, and then I fear me much that her friends will be revolted by seeing her run to succor and aid the murderer of her brother." "Such scandal should be prevented." "I trust I have taken precautions to that effect. I am her lawful guardian, and have just succeeded in obtaining permission to escort her, after the funeral of Apicides, to my own house. There, please the gods, she will be secure." "You have done well, sage Abarces. And now yonder is the house of Sallust. The gods keep you. Yet, hark you, Arbaces, why so gloomy and unsocial? Men say you can be gay, why not let me initiate you into the pleasures of Pompeii? I flatter myself no one knows them better." "I thank you, noble Clodius. Under your auspices I might venture, I think, to wear the philyra, but at my age I should be an awkward pupil." "Oh, never fear, I have made converts of fellows of 70. The rich, too, are never old." "You flatter me. At some future time I will remind you of your promise." "You may command Marcus Clodius at all times. And so, vale." "Now," said the Egyptian, soliloquizing, "I am not wantonly a man of blood. I would willingly save this Greek, if, by confessing the crime, he will lose himself for ever to Ione, and for ever free me from the chance of discovery. And I can save him by persuading Julia to own the philtre, which will be held his excuse. But if he do not confess the crime, why, Julia must be shamed from the confession, and he must die. Die, lest he prove my rival with the living. Die, that he may be my proxy with the dead. Will he confess? Can he not be persuaded that in his delirium he struck the blow? To me it would give far greater safety than even his death. We must hazard the experiment." Sweeping along the narrow street, Arbaces now approached the house of Sallust. when he beheld a dark form wrapped in a cloak and stretched at length across the threshold of the door. So still lay the figure, and so dim was its outline, that any other than Arbaces might have felt a superstitious fear, lest he beheld one of those grim lemures who, above all other spots, haunted the threshold of the homes they formerly possessed. But not for Arbaces were such dreams. "Rise," said he, touching the figure with his foot. "Thou obstructest the way." "Ha! Who art thou?" cried the form in a sharp tone, and as she raised herself from the ground, the starlight fell full on the pale face and fixed but sightless eyes of Nydia the Thessalian. "Who art thou? I know the burden of thy voice." "Blind girl, what dost thou here at this late hour? Fie! Is this seeming thy sex or years? Home, girl!" "I know thee," said Nadia in a low voice. "Thou art Arbaces the Egyptian." Then, as if inspired by some sudden impulse, she flung herself at his feet, and clasping his knees, exclaimed, in a wild and passionate tone, "O dread and potent man! Save him! Save him! He is not guilty. It is I. He lies within, ill dying, and I am the hateful cause. And they will not admit me to him. They spurn the blind girl from the hall. Oh, heal him! Thou knowest some herb, some spell, some counter charm, for it is a potion that hath wrought this frenzy." "Hush, child, I know all. Thou forgettest that I accompanied Julia to the Saga's home. Doubtless her hand administered the draught, but her reputation demands thy silence. Reproach not thyself. What must be, must. Meanwhile, I seek the criminal. He may yet be saved. Away." Thus saying, Arbaces extricated himself from the clasp of the despairing Thessalian, and knocked loudly at the door. In a few moments the heavy bars were heard suddenly to yield, and the porter, half opening the door, demanded who was there. "Arbaces, important business to Sallust relative to Glaucus. I come from the praetor." The porter, half yawning, half groaning, admitted the tall form of the Egyptian. Nydia sprang forward. "How is he?" she cried. "Tell me, tell me!" "Ho, mad girl! Is it thou still? For shame! Why, they say he is sensible." "The gods be praised! And you will not admit me? Ah, I beseech thee—" "Admit thee, no! A pretty salute I should prepare for these shoulders were I to admit such things as thou. Go home." The door closed, and Nydia, with a deep sigh, laid herself down once more on the cold stones, and wrapping her cloak around her face, resumed her weary vigil. Meanwhile, Arbaces had already gained the triclinium, where Sallust, with his favourite freedman, sat late at supper. "What, Arbaces, and at this hour! Accept this cup." "Nay, gentle Sallust, it is on business, not pleasure, that I venture to disturb thee. How doth thy charge? They say in the town that he has recovered sense." "Alas and truly," replied the good-natured but thoughtless Sallust, wiping the tear from his eyes. "But so shattered are his nerves and frame that I scarcely recognize the brilliant and gay carouser I was wont to know. Yet, strange to say, he cannot account for the cause of the sudden frenzy that seized him. He retains but a dim consciousness of what hath passed, and, despite thy witness, wise Egyptian, solemnly upholds his innocence of the death of Apicides." "Sallust," said Arbaces, gravely, "there is much in thy friend's case that merits a peculiar indulgence, and could we learn from his lips the confession and the cause of his crime, much might be yet hoped from the mercy of the Senate; for the Senate, thou knowest, hath the power either to mitigate or to sharpen the law. Therefore it is that I have conferred with the highest authority in the city, and obtained his permission to hold a private conference this night with the Athenian. Tomorrow, thou knowest, the trial comes on." "Well," said Sallust, "thou wilt be worthy of thy Eastern name and fame if thou canst learn aught from him. But thou mayest try. Poor Glaucus! And he had such an excellent appetite. He eats nothing now." The benevolent epicure was moved sensibly at this thought. He sighed, and ordered his slaves to refill his cup. "Night wanes," said the Egyptian. "Suffer me to see thy ward now." Sallust nodded assent, and led the way to a small chamber, guarded without by 2 dozing slaves. The door opened. At the request of Arbaces, Sallust withdrew. The Egyptian was alone with Glaucus. One of those tall and graceful candelabra common to that day, supporting a single lamp, burned beside the narrow bed. Its rays fell palely over the face of the Athenian, and Arbaces was moved to see how sensibly that countenance had changed. The rich color was gone, the cheek was sunk, the lips were convulsed and pallid. Fierce had been the struggle between reason and madness, life and death. The youth, the strength of Glaucus, had conquered, but the freshness of blood and soul, the life of life, its glory and its zest, were gone forever. The Egyptian seated himself quietly beside the bed. Glaucus still lay mute and unconscious of his presence. At length, after a considerable pause, Arbaces thus spoke: "Glaucus, we have been enemies. I come to thee alone and in the dead of night. Thy friend, perhaps thy saviour." As the steed starts from the path of the tiger, Glaucus sprang up breathless, alarmed, panting at the abrupt voice, the sudden apparition of his foe. Their eyes met, and neither, for some moments, had power to withdraw his gaze. The flush went and came over the face of the Athenian, and the bronzed cheek of the Egyptian grew a shade more pale. At length, with an inward groan, Glaucus turned away, drew his hand across his brow, sunk back, and muttered, "Am I still dreaming?" "No, Glaucus, thou art awake. By this right hand and my father's head, thou seest one who may save thy life. Hark! I know what thou hast done, but I know also its excuse, of which thou thyself art ignorant. Thou hast committed murder, it is true, a sacrilegious murder. Frown not, start not, these eyes saw it. But I can save thee. I can prove how thou wert bereaved of sense, and made not a free-thinking and free-acting man. But in order to save thee, thou must confess thy crime. Sign but this paper acknowledging thy hand in the death of Opposites, and thou shalt avoid the fatal urn." "What words are these? Murder and Opposites! Did I not see him stretched on the ground bleeding in a corpse? And wouldst thou persuade me that I did the deed? Man, thou liest. Away!" "Be not rash. Glaucus, be not hasty. The deed is proved. Come, come, thou mayest well be excused for not recalling the act of thy delirium, and which thy sober senses would have shunned even to contemplate. But let me try to refresh thy exhausted and weary memory. Thou knowest thou wert walking with the priest, disputing about his sister. Thou knowest he was intolerant, and half a Nazarene, and he sought to convert thee, and ye had hot words. And he calumniated thy mode of life, and swore he would not marry Ione to thee. And then, in thy wrath and thy frenzy, thou didst strike the sudden blow. Come, come, you can recollect this. Read this papyrus, it runs to that effect. Sign it, and thou art saved." "Barbarian, give me the written lie, that I may tear it. I, the murderer of Ione's brother. I confess to have injured one hair of the head of him she loved. Let me rather perish 1,000 times." "Beware," said Arbaces, in a low and hissing tone. "There is but one choice, thy confession and thy signature, or the amphitheatre and the lion's maw." As the Egyptian fixed his eyes upon the sufferer, he hailed with joy the signs of evident emotion that seized the latter at these words. A slight shudder passed over the Athenian's frame. His lip fell. An expression of sudden fear and wonder betrayed itself in his brow and eye. "Great gods!" he said in a low voice. "What reverse is this? It seems but a little day since life laughed out from amidst roses. Ione mine, youth, health, love, lavishing on me their treasures. And now, pain, madness, shame, death. And for what? What have I done? Oh, am I mad still? Sign and be saved, said the soft, sweet voice of the Egyptian. Tempter, never! Cried Glaucus, in the reaction of rage. Thou knowest me not. Thou knowest not the haughty soul of an Athenian. The sudden face of death might appall me for a moment, but the fear is over. Dishonor appalls forever. Who will debase his name to save his life? Who exchange clear thoughts for sullen days? Who will belie himself to shame, and stand blackened in the eyes of love? If to earn a few years of polluted life there be so base a coward, dream not, dull barbarian of Egypt. To find him in one who has trod the same sod as Harmodius, and breathed the same air as Socrates. Go, leave me to live without self-reproach, or to perish without fear. Bethink thee well, the lion's fangs, the hoots of the brutal mob, the vulgar gaze on thy dying agony and mutilated limbs, thy name degraded, thy corpse unburied, the shame thou wouldst avoid clinging to thee for aye and ever. Thou ravest, thou art the madman. Shame is not in the loss of another man's esteem, it is in the loss of our own. Wilt thou go? My eyes loathe the sight of thee. Hating ever, I despise thee now. I go, said Arbaces, stung and exasperated, but not without some pitying admiration of his victim. I go. We meet twice again, once at the trial, once at the death. Farewell. The Egyptian rose slowly, gathered his robes about him, and left the chamber. He sought Sallust for a moment, whose eyes began to reel with the vigils of the cup. He is still unconscious, or still obstinate. There is no hope for him. Say not so, replied Sallust, who felt but little resentment against the Athenian's accuser, for he possessed no great austerity of virtue, and was rather moved by his friend's reverses than persuaded of his innocence. Say not so, my Egyptian, so good a drinker shall be saved if possible. Bacchus against Isis. We shall see, said the Egyptian. Suddenly the bolts were again withdrawn, the door unclosed, Arbaces was in the open street, and poor Nydia once more started from her long watch. Wilt thou save him? She cried, clasping her hands. Child, follow me home, I would speak to thee. It is for his sake I ask it. And thou wilt save him? No answer came forth to the thirsting ear of the blind girl. Arbaces had already proceeded far up the street. She hesitated a moment, and then followed his steps in silence. I must secure this girl, said he musingly, lest she give evidence of the philter. As to the vain Julia, she will not betray herself. End of Book 4, Chapter 7. Book 4, Chapter 8 of Last Days of Pompeii. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Last Days of Pompeii by Edward G. Bulwer Lytton. Book 4, Chapter 8. A Classic Funeral. While Arbaces had been thus employed, sorrow and death were in the house of Ione. It was the night preceding the morn in which the solemn funeral rites were to be decreed to the remains of the murdered Apicides. The corpse had been removed from the temple of Isis to the house of the nearest surviving relative, and Ione had heard, in the same breath, the death of her brother and the accusation against her betrothed. That first violent anguish which blunts the sense of all but itself, and the forbearing silence of her slaves, had prevented her from learning minutely the circumstances attendant on the fate of her lover. His illness